crisp, cold air, carrying the sky over North Yorkshire settled into the deep, velvet black of a moonless November night. A crisp, cold air, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, descended from the fells, wrapping the valleys in a profound silence. It was a Tuesday, the 17th of the month in the year. The land, ancient and patient, seemed to breathe in the stillness, its rolling hills and dry stone walls etched in shades of grey and charcoal. In the scattered villages and isolated farmhouses, lights glowed with a warm, steady presence, each a small bastion against the vast, indifferent darkness. The rhythm of the evening was one of routine, of dinners cleared and fires stoked, of a landscape settling into a familiar, nightly repose. Nothing in the air or on the ground suggested that this particular night would be anything other than ordinary. The quiet was absolute, a baseline of normalcy against which any deviation would be starkly measured. Thomas Greenwood, at 67, moved with the unhurried, deliberate pace of a man who had walked these hills his entire life. His cottage, a sturdy stone structure nestled in a fold of the land near Malham, was a point of stillness in his world. Inside, the scent of brewed tea and old books filled the air. Names and stories by his grandfather. They were fixed points in his life, reliable and unchanging. He noted the slow, blinking passage of a commercial flight on its approach to Leeds Bradford Airport, its path a predictable line against the celestial backdrop. Everything was as it should be. The air was still, the sheep were settled, and the stars were in their rightful places. The world felt solid, knowable, and secure under the vast, silent canopy of the night. Police Constable Andrew Millward steered his patrol car along the winding, unlit road between Grassington and Kettlewell. The Vauxhall's headlights cut a lonely tunnel through the darkness. At 29, he was still relatively new to the rural. He pulled on his worn tweed jacket, the fabric a familiar weight on his shoulders, and stepped outside. The cold air was a familiar friend. His flock was quiet, their shapes soft, woolly mounds in the darkness of the nearby pasture. Thomas's routine was as old as the hills themselves. A final check on the sheep, a long look at the night sky, and then the comfort of his hearth. He was a man of the earth, his understanding of the world rooted in the seasons, the weather, and the stars. His knowledge was practical, deep, and devoid of fantasy. He knew the lights of every passing aircraft, the distant glow of Skipton on the horizon, and the precise arc of the planets across the heavens. In Harrogate, 30 miles to the east, the silence was of a different kind. It was the muted hum of a town at rest, the distant sigh of traffic on the A, the soft glow of streetlights on wet pavement. Inside a modern terraced house, Sarah and David Chen were finishing their evening. The television murmured in the background, a documentary about ocean life. David was scrolling through his phone while Sarah stood at the window, looking out over the rooftops. They were a young couple, their lives a tapestry of work, friends, and quiet evenings like this. The contrast with Thomas Greenwood's world was stark. Their environment was one of structured streets and shared walls, their connection to the night sky filtered through the orange haze of urban light pollution. Yet, they too felt the same sense of Tuesday night normalcy, a comfortable, predictable rhythm before the start of another working day. Thomas Greenwood's gaze drifted upward. The clarity of the sky was exceptional tonight. The Milky Way, a faint, shimmering river of light, was visible from horizon to horizon. He picked out the familiar constellations. Orion climbing in the east, Cassiopeia high in the north. He had been watching these same stars since he was a boy, taught their names and stories by his grandfather. They were fixed points in his life, reliable and unchanging. He noted the slow, blinking passage of a commercial flight on its approach to Leeds Bradford Airport, its path a predictable line against the celestial backdrop. Everything was as it should be. The air was still, the sheep were settled, and the stars were in their rightful places. The world felt solid, knowable, and secure under the vast, silent canopy of the night. Police Constable Andrew Millward steered his patrol car along the winding, unlit road between Grassington and Kettlewell. The Vauxhall's headlights cut a lonely tunnel through the darkness. At 29, he was still relatively new to the rural beat, having transferred from the busier streets of York a year prior. He had sought the quiet, the sense of community, the feeling of being a part of the landscape rather than just policing it. Tonight, the quiet was almost absolute. His radio had been silent for the better part of an hour. The calls he had attended to earlier were minor. A dispute over a garden fence, a report of a loose sheep on the road. It was the mundane, everyday work of a rural officer. He felt a sense of peace, a feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, a quiet guardian in the vast, sleeping expanse of the Yorkshire Dales. At the Malham Tarn Field Centre, a hub of scientific research nestled in the national park, Dr. Fiona McLeish was preparing for a long night of observation. At 41, she was a respected astronomer from the University of Durham, here on a short-term project to study stellar parallax. Her domain was one of precision, of data points and careful calibration. The centre's small observatory dome was open to the cold night air, the telescope a complex silhouette of metal and glass pointed at the heavens. On her laptop, lines of code scrolled as the telescope's tracking system aligned with its target star. For Fiona, the sky was not a source of romantic wonder, but a vast, intricate clockwork to be measured, understood, and documented. Her work required patience, meticulous attention to detail, and a deep-seated belief that every phenomenon, no matter how strange, had a rational, physical explanation. In the hushed, dimly lit control room of Leeds Bradford Airport, the atmosphere was one of calm professionalism. Green and amber lights blinked on the radar screens, each representing an aircraft moving through the controlled airspace. Robert Thorne, a senior pilot with British Airways, was at the controls of Flight E, a routine shuttle from Heathrow. At 58, he had spent more than 30 years in the cockpit, his experience vast and his demeanour unflappable. He was guiding the Airbus A through its final approach, the aircraft a steady, graceful presence in the night sky. The conversation with air traffic control was a familiar, practiced ballet of call signs, altitudes, and headings. It was a language of precision and safety, a routine he had performed thousands of times. The lights of the towns and villages below were a familiar, comforting map, guiding him home. It was a flicker, nothing more. A brief, almost imperceptible pulse of light in the corner of his eye. Thomas Greenwood paused, his hand resting on the cold stone of the wall. He scanned the sky in the direction of the flicker, towards the dark mass of Fountains Fell. He saw nothing but the familiar pattern of stars. He blinked, attributing it to tired eyes or a trick of the cold air. He had seen such things before. The brief glint of a satellite, the distant flash of a car's headlights catching a high-altitude aircraft. He was about to turn back towards the warmth of his cottage when it happened again. This time it was clearer, a soft, amber-coloured pulse that bloomed and faded in the space of a second. It was not a star. It was not an aircraft. It was something else. "David, come and look at this." Sarah's voice was quiet, laced with curiosity. She was still at the window, her breath misting the cold glass. David looked up from his phone, mildly annoyed at the interruption. "What is it?" he asked. "I don't know," she replied, her eyes fixed on the sky. "There are these weird lights over there towards the west." David sighed and joined her at the window. He followed her pointing finger, his eyes scanning the hazy, light-polluted sky. At first he saw nothing. Then he caught it, a single amber-colored light pulsing softly. It was faint, but undeniably there. "Probably a helicopter," he said, his voice dismissive. "No," Sarah insisted. "It's not moving, and it's not blinking like a helicopter." P.C. Millwood saw it too, a flash of amber light in his peripheral vision, reflecting briefly off his windscreen. It was unusual enough to make him slow down and pull the patrol car into a lay-by. He cut the engine, plunging the world into an even deeper silence and darkness. He stepped out of the car, the cold air sharp in his lungs. He scanned the sky, his eyes slowly adjusting. And then he saw them. Not one, but three distinct amber lights hanging silently in the sky above the ridge to the north. They were not flashing, they were pulsing, a slow, rhythmic beat, like a heartbeat. He had never seen anything like it. His police training kicked in, a mental checklist of possibilities, flares, drones, military exercise, but none of them seemed to fit. On the screen in front of Dr. Fiona McLeish, a line of data wavered. A small, unexpected spike in the background electromagnetic readings. It was a minor anomaly, likely caused by a piece of equipment cycling on or a distant radio signal. She noted it in her log with a practiced efficiency. But the anomaly persisted, a low-level hum of interference that hadn't been there moments before. Annoyed, she looked up from her screen, her gaze sweeping across the observatory's open dome. Her eyes, trained to notice the slightest change in the celestial sphere, were immediately drawn to a patch of sky to the southeast. There, against the backdrop of the constellation Taurus, were three amber lights that did not belong. They were not stars, they were not planets, and they were pulsing with a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Bradford Control, this is Speedbird." Robert Thorne's voice was calm, but with an underlying note of professional curiosity. "Go ahead, Speedbird," the controller replied, his tone relaxed. "We have a visual on some unusual light activity about 10 miles to our northwest. Appears to be a formation of 3 to 4 amber lights, stationary at our altitude." There was a brief pause from the control tower. The controller's eyes scanned his radar screen. It was clean. There were no other registered aircraft in that sector. "Speedbird, we have nothing on our scopes in that position. Can you confirm the sighting?" "Affirmative, Bradford," Thorne replied, his co-pilot now also staring out the cockpit window. "They're still there? No strobes, no navigation lights? Just pulsing?" Thomas Greenwood was no longer dismissing what he was seeing. There were 5 of them now, arranged in a loose, irregular pattern against the dark flank of the fell. The amber light was soft yet distinct, and the pulsing was perfectly synchronized across all 5 objects. He watched, his breath held, as they began to move. It was not the movement of an aircraft. They drifted slowly, silently, maintaining their formation. Then 2 of the lights descended, dropping several hundred feet in a smooth, controlled motion, while the other 3 remained stationary. There was no sound, no roar of engines, no whine of turbines. Just a profound, unnerving silence. A shiver ran down his spine, and it had nothing to do with the cold. "I'm filming it," David said, his initial skepticism replaced by a focused excitement. He was holding his phone up to the window, trying to keep it steady. On the small screen, the lights were faint, pixelated smudges of amber against the dark grey of the sky. "They're moving now," Sarah whispered, her hand on his shoulder. The lights, which had been stationary, were now drifting slowly to the north, their synchronized pulsing unwavering. "This is weird," David muttered, zooming in as much as he could, sacrificing what little clarity he had for a closer view. Really weird. They were no longer just watching something unusual. They were documenting it, creating a piece of evidence, a digital record of the impossible. "Control, this is Delta Zulu." PC Millward's voice was steady as he spoke into his radio, but his heart was pounding. "Go ahead, DZ," the dispatcher's voice crackled back. "I'm reporting a visual on multiple unidentified aerial phenomena. I have at least 5 amber-colored lights, stationary and pulsing, located over the ridge north of Kettlewell. They are not consistent with any known aircraft." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. The dispatcher, a veteran of 1,000 night shifts, had heard his share of strange reports, but the calm, professional tone of the officer on the ground gave this one a different weight. "Roger that, DZ," she replied. "Stay on scene and keep them under observation. We're starting to get calls." Dr. Fiona McLeish had abandoned her original project. She swung the large telescope towards the amber lights, her fingers flying across the keyboard to adjust the focus and tracking. Through the eyepiece, the view was stunning. The lights were not simple points. They were spheres, their surfaces glowing with a soft, internal luminescence. There was no visible structure, no wings, no rotors, no exhaust. They were perfect, silent, pulsing orbs of light. She quickly attached a spectroscopic camera, her mind racing. This was not astronomy. This was something else entirely. She was a scientist, and she was witnessing something that defied easy explanation. Her primary instinct was not fear or wonder, but an overwhelming, urgent need to collect data. In the Leeds Bradford control tower, the atmosphere had shifted. The relaxed calm had been replaced by a low hum of focused tension. Robert Thorne's report had been the first, but it was not the last. A second pilot on a cargo flight from the east had now reported the same lights. The senior controller was on the phone to the RAF's Air Defence Centre at Bulmer. "Negative, Bradford," the military controller's voice came back, calm and official. "We have no primary returns in that sector. No military exercises, no drones, nothing scheduled." The civilian controller looked at his screen, then back out the window into the darkness. 2 experienced pilots were reporting the same thing, but his screens and the military's remained stubbornly, impossibly blank. And then the calls began to flood in, from Pateley Bridge to Ripon, from isolated farmhouses in Nidderdale to suburban streets in Skipton. The switchboard at the North Yorkshire Police Headquarters lit up. The reports were all variations on the same theme: strange, silent, amber lights pulsing in the night sky. Some callers were panicked, others were curious. Some had seen a single light, others a formation of 5 or more. The dispatchers worked with practiced efficiency, logging the calls, plotting the locations on a digital map. A pattern began to emerge. The sightings were concentrated in a wide corridor stretching across the heart of the Dales. A silent, luminous wave moving slowly across the county. Thomas Greenwood watched, rooted to the spot, as the lights performed their final, impossible act. The 5 spheres, which had been drifting slowly, suddenly stopped. They hung in the air for a long moment, their amber pulsing seeming to intensify. Then, in perfect unison, they began to oscillate vertically, moving up and down in a smooth, rapid motion like a child's toy on a string. The movement was precise, mechanical, and utterly silent. Just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The lights held their position for a final, breathless second. Then they accelerated, moving from a dead stop to an incredible velocity in an instant. They did not fly away, they simply vanished, streaking upwards and disappearing from sight in the blink of an eye. Silence returned to the valleys and fells of North Yorkshire. In his field, Thomas Greenwood stood staring at the empty patch of sky, the cold seeping into his bones. In Harrogate, Sarah and David Chen lowered their phone, looking at each other in stunned disbelief. In his lay-by, P.C. Andrew Millward let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. At the Malham Tarn Observatory, Dr. Fiona McLeish saved her data, her mind a whirlwind of questions. In the cockpit of flight, Robert Thorne and his co-pilot exchanged a long, silent look. The quiet was the same as it had been before, the same deep, profound stillness of a November night. But for those who had seen, the silence was now filled with the echo of an impossible question. The world was no longer quite so solid, no longer quite so knowable. The dawn of November the worst broke over the Pennines with a palette of pale grey and muted pink. A thin layer of mist clung to the valley floors, softening the rugged contours of the land. The world awoke to a day that felt, on the surface, entirely ordinary. The routines of rural life began as they always did. The clatter of milk churns, the lowing of cattle, the rumble of the first tractors. In the towns, the rhythm was one of commuter traffic and the opening of shops. Yet, for a small but growing number of people, the familiar landscape now held a new and unsettling dimension. The memory of the silent pulsing lights was a dissonant note in the morning's chorus, a secret held beneath the veneer of normalcy. The sky, now a placid, unassuming blue, offered no answers. In the North Yorkshire Police Control Room, the night shift was handing over to the day team. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the low hum of computer servers. The log of overnight incidents was dominated by one topic, the lights. Dozens of entries, each with a time stamp, a location, and a brief, often bewildered, description. The day shift supervisor, a pragmatic inspector named Davies, scanned the list with a skeptical eye. He'd seen it all before: meteor showers, satellite re-entries, Chinese lanterns. There was always an explanation. "Right," he said, addressing the room, "let's get a handle on this. I want every report collated and mapped, and get in touch with the Met Office in Leeds Bradford. Let's kill this with facts before the local papers run away with it." Dr. Eleanor Hartley was in her office at the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, DSTL facility at Porton Down, nearly miles to the south. At 45, she was a senior analyst in the field of signals intelligence, a specialist in identifying and interpreting anomalous data. Her world was one of secure networks, classified reports, and the quiet intellectual challenge of finding patterns in chaos. A former RAF intelligence officer, she was known for her sharp, analytical mind and her calm, unflappable demeanor. Her morning had begun, as it always did, with a review of overnight intelligence summaries from various military and civilian sources. It was a routine she had followed for years, a methodical search for the unusual, the unexpected, the unexplained. P.C. Andrew Millward was writing his report. The words felt inadequate, clumsy attempts to capture the profound strangeness of what he had witnessed. Multiple unidentified aerial phenomena, amber-colored silent, synchronized, pulsing, rapid, non-ballistic acceleration. Each phrase was technically accurate, yet failed to convey the sheer impossibility of the event. He had checked in with his sergeant, who had listened patiently, his expression a mixture of concern and weary skepticism. Millward knew how it sounded. He was a young officer, eager to make a good impression. A report like this could be seen as a sign of an overactive imagination, a mark against his name. But he had seen what he had seen. He wrote with a determined clarity, sticking to the facts, his professionalism a shield against the ridicule he feared might come. At the Civil Aviation Authority headquarters in London, James Wickham was enjoying his second coffee of the morning. At 38, he was a senior air traffic analyst, a man who lived and breathed the intricate three-dimensional dance of UK airspace. His desk was covered in charts, flight plans, and data printouts. He was known for his encyclopedic knowledge of aviation regulations and his unwavering belief in the predictability of the skies. His colleague dropped a preliminary report on his desk. "Morning, James. Got a weird one for you. Multiple pilot and civilian reports of unidentified lights over the Pennines last night. RAF says it wasn't them." James sighed. "It's always something. Flares, weather balloons, someone's new drone. It's never anything interesting." Dr. Fiona McLeish had not slept. The data from her spectroscopic camera was displayed on her laptop screen, a series of complex graphs and tables. The light from the amber spheres was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was not the product of combustion. It was not the light of any known type of plasma. The spectrum was narrow, almost monochromatic, with an unusual spike in the infrared range. It was, for lack of a better term, clean, too clean. She ran the data through 3 different analysis programs and each came back with the same result: inconclusive. The light signature did not match any known natural or man-made source in her database. She felt a thrill of pure scientific excitement mingled with a profound sense of unease. Thomas Greenwood stood on the edge of his pasture, looking at the ground. The sheep were agitated, clustered together at the far end of the field, their usual morning grazing forgotten. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the damp grass. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. A mark, a sign, something to prove that what he had seen was real. He found nothing. The ground was undisturbed, the grass unmarked. It was as if the lights had never been there. He felt a flicker of self-doubt. Had he imagined it? A trick of the light, a dream? But the memory was too vivid, too real. And the behavior of his sheep, their deep, instinctual fear, was something he could not ignore. They knew something had been here. Eleanor Hartley's morning routine was interrupted by a flagged report that had appeared on her secure terminal. It was a low-priority summary from the RAF's Air Defence and Airspace Management ADAM cell at Bulmer. The subject line was innocuous. Anomalous luminous phenomena, North Yorkshire. Such reports were not uncommon. They usually detailed meteor sightings or atmospheric quirks, but this one was different. It contained a cross-reference to a civilian police log with over 50 individual witness reports, and, most intriguingly, a formal report from a British Airways pilot. Eleanor's interest was piqued. She opened the file, her eyes scanning the preliminary details with a practiced speed. Her calm, analytical mind began to connect the dots. In Harrogate, David Chen was showing his video to his colleagues at the small marketing firm where he worked. The footage was shaky, the lights indistinct, but it was enough to generate a buzz of excitement in the office. "You should send that to the local paper," one of them suggested, "or put it on YouTube. It could go viral." David felt a small thrill at the idea. The night's strangeness had transformed into a morning's novelty, a story to be shared, a piece of minor local fame. Sarah, however, was less enthusiastic. She had felt a sense of awe, even fear, watching the lights. To her, it was not a joke or a viral video. It was something profound, something that had shifted her perception of the world, She felt a protective instinct over the memory, a reluctance to see it cheapened or sensationalized. James Wickham read the full report from the BA pilot, Robert Thorne. Thorne was one of the most senior and respected pilots in the fleet. He was not prone to exaggeration or fantasy. His description was precise, professional, and utterly baffling. Stationary at feet, no transponder signal, no heat signature, on weather radar, visual confirmation of non-ballistic movement. James pulled up the radar logs from the Leeds Bradford control tower for the corresponding time. As the report stated, there was nothing there, just the clean, predictable sweep of the radar showing only registered, transponder-equipped aircraft. He felt a prickle of annoyance. He hated anomalies. They were messy, unprofessional. They were a problem to be solved, an untidy, loose end in his perfectly ordered world. Inspector Davies held his morning briefing. The map on the main screen was now dotted with dozens of yellow markers, each representing a witness report. They formed a clear, distinct corridor, running roughly west to east, directly over some of the most remote and sparsely populated areas of the Dales. "Right," he said, his voice firm. "We've spoken to the RAF. They're adamant there was nothing of theirs in the air. Leeds Bradford confirms multiple pilot sightings, but nothing on their radar. The Met Office reports clear skies, no atmospheric anomalies, so we have a problem." He looked around the room. "I want a team to start re-interviewing the key witnesses. I want to know what they had for dinner, how much they had to drink. We start from the ground up. We find the rational explanation." Eleanor Hartley made a phone call. It was to an old colleague, a wing commander named Marcus Ashford, who now served as the MOD's liaison with the Civil Aviation Authority. "Marcus, it's Eleanor. I'm looking at the Bulmer report on the Yorkshire Lights." Ashford's voice was cautious. "I thought you might be. It's a strange one." "The pilot reports are what interest me," Eleanor said, "and the sheer number of civilian witnesses. This isn't a single-source anomaly." "I agree," Ashford replied, "but without a primary radar return, it's officially classified as a non-event, just a collection of visual misinterpretations." Eleanor was silent for a moment. "I'm not so sure," she said, her voice thoughtful. "I think this one might be worth a closer look. Off the books for now." D.S. Claire Osborne was assigned to lead the witness interview team. At 41, she was a sharp, experienced detective, known for her ability to build rapport with witnesses and her meticulous attention to detail. Her first stop was a small, isolated cottage near Malham. The witness was a retired shepherd named Thomas Greenwood. She expected to find an elderly, perhaps confused man easily swayed by a trick of the light. Instead, she found a man with a quiet dignity, a sharp mind, and an unshakable certainty in what he had seen. He described the event with a precision and clarity that impressed her. He spoke of the silence, the synchronized pulsing, the impossible acceleration. He was not a man prone to fantasy. He was a credible witness. Professor Alistair Brennan, a physicist at the University of Manchester, received an email from a former student, Dr. Fiona McLeish. The email was cautiously worded, but the attached data was explosive. Brennan, at 62, was a leading expert in atmospheric physics and radar technology. He had consulted for the government on numerous occasions. He looked at Fiona's spectroscopic analysis, his eyebrows rising slowly. The light signature was bizarre. It obeyed certain physical laws, but not others. It was as if someone had found a way to bend the rules. He read her description of the visual sighting, her report of the electromagnetic interference. He felt a familiar, long-dormant excitement. It reminded him of the stories, the classified reports he'd been shown years ago, cases from the 70s and 80s that had been quietly buried. James Wickham's tidy world was becoming increasingly messy. The official explanation drafted by the CAA's Public Relations Department was that the sightings were likely caused by a combination of high-altitude ice crystals, reflecting ground lights, and a number of unregistered drone flights. It was a plausible catch-all explanation designed to close the book on the incident, but it didn't sit right with him. It didn't explain the pilot sightings at feet. It didn't explain the synchronized movement. It didn't explain the silence. He found himself rereading Robert Thorne's report, the pilot's calm, factual words, a stark contrast to the easy dismissal of the official statement. For the first time in a long time, James Wickham felt a seed of doubt. David Chen's video was now on the website of the Yorkshire Post. It was grainy, shaky, and ultimately inconclusive. But it was tangible. It was something people could see, share, and debate. The story was the most read article on the site. The comments section was a predictable mix of true believers, angry debunkers, and sarcastic jokes. The incident was no longer a collection of individual experiences. It had become a public event, a piece of local folklore in the making. The narrative was slipping out of the hands of the authorities and taking on a life of its own. The pressure for a definitive explanation was mounting. D.S. Osborne drove away from Thomas Greenwood's cottage, her professional skepticism shaken. She had interviewed hundreds of witnesses in her career. She knew the signs of confusion, of exaggeration, of outright fabrication. She had seen none of them in the old shepherd. He was telling the truth, or at least what he profoundly believed to be the truth. She had two more primary witnesses to interview, a young couple in Harrogate who had filmed the event, and one of her own, a PC who had been on patrol. Her next stop was the Malham Tarn Field Centre to speak with a scientist who had also reported the lights. A scientist. That changed things. This was no longer just a collection of anecdotal reports. It was something more. Eleanor Hartley formally requested access to the full, unredacted witness statements from the North Yorkshire Police. It was an unusual request, crossing the streams of civilian and military intelligence, but she used Wing Commander Ashford's official channels to smooth the way. She also requested the raw data from Dr. Fiona McLeish's observatory and the full, unedited radar logs from Leeds Bradford and the RAF. She was building a case file, a private, off-the-books investigation into an event that was, officially, a non-event. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity. The pieces were scattered, the data incomplete, the picture fuzzy. But there was a picture, she was sure of it, and she was determined to bring it into focus. In the Ministry of Defence building in Whitehall, a single-page summary of the Yorkshire incident landed on the desk of a junior minister, Patricia Caldwell. It was filed under civilian airspace incursions. Unverified, the summary was brief, noting the high volume of civilian reports and the lack of corroborating radar evidence. The official recommendation was to support the CAA's public statement and to take no further action. The minister, a busy woman with a dozen more pressing issues on her agenda, initialed the document without a second thought. The file was closed. Officially, the case of the Pennine. Lights was over. But for a small group of people, a shepherd, a scientist, a police officer, a pilot, and a quiet intelligence analyst, it was just beginning. The sun set on November the 1st, painting the Yorkshire sky in hues of orange and purple. The land settled once more into the quiet of the evening, but this time the quiet felt different. It was a watchful quiet. All across the Dales, people looked up at the sky with a new sense of wonder and a new sense of unease. They were looking for the lights. They were waiting for them to return. The familiar, predictable world had been cracked open, and something strange and unknown had slipped through. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a question that hung in the cold, clear air, as silent and as luminous as the lights themselves. On the morning of November the 3rd, a fragile sense of order was being imposed. In the offices of the North Yorkshire Police, Inspector Davies's team was deep in the process of collation. The witness reports, now numbering over 100, were being cross-referenced by time and location. A large map, both digital and physical, was becoming a complex web of sight lines and trajectories. The official narrative, as dictated by the CAA and supported by the MOD, was holding a combination of atmospheric conditions and probable drone activity. It was a neat, tidy explanation that satisfied the media and reassured the public. But for those on the inside, the explanation was beginning to feel thin, a threadbare blanket stretched over a collection of sharp, uncomfortable facts. DS Claire Osborne's second interview was with Sarah and David Chen. She met them in their neat, modern living room in Harrogate. They were cooperative, eager to help, but their perspectives were already diverging. David was focused on the video, the digital evidence, the potential for public recognition. He had uploaded a slightly edited version to his YouTube channel, where it was rapidly gaining views. Sarah, however, was more hesitant. She spoke of the feeling the lights had evoked, a sense of profound strangeness, of something ancient and intelligent. It felt alive, she said, struggling to find the words. Claire listened patiently, noting the subtle tension between the couple. The event was no longer just a shared memory. It was becoming a source of friction, a test of their different ways of seeing the world. Claire watched the video on David's laptop. It was exactly as she had expected. Shaky, out of focus, the lights little more than indistinct amber blobs against a noisy, pixelated background. It was compelling as a piece of anecdotal evidence, but as a tool for forensic analysis it was almost useless. "Did you see any structure?" she asked. "Any shape to the objects themselves?" David shook his head. "No, they were just lights, bright but soft, you know." Sarah added, "There was no sound. That was the weirdest thing. It was completely silent." Claire made a note. The silence. It was a recurring theme, a consistent detail in almost every witness statement. It was one of the sharp, uncomfortable facts that the official explanation failed to address. At DSTL, Eleanor Hartley was building her own map. It was a multi-layered digital construct, far more complex than the one at the police headquarters. She overlaid the witness sightlines with topographical data, aviation charts, and geological surveys. She was not just looking at where people had seen the lights. She was looking at the landscape over which the lights had appeared. A preliminary pattern was beginning to catch her eye. The flight path, as described by the witnesses, seemed to follow the contours of the North Craven Fault, a major geological feature of the Yorkshire Dales. It was a tentative correlation, perhaps just a coincidence, but in Eleanor's world there were no coincidences until they were proven to be so. James Wickham was having a bad morning. The Yorkshire incident, which should have been a closed case, was refusing to go away. 2 more pilots had come forward, filing confidential reports through their union. They had seen the lights too, from different angles and at different times, but their descriptions were remarkably consistent with Robert Thorne's. They had been reluctant to file official reports for fear of ridicule or professional sanction, a culture of silence that James knew was pervasive among pilots. He now had 4 senior, credible aviators all describing the same impossible event. The tidy explanation of ice crystals and drones was beginning to look not just thin, but absurd. Wing Commander Marcus Ashford met with Eleanor Hartley in a secure video conference. His face was etched with a familiar, weary frustration. "The official position is unchanged, Eleanor. No primary radar, no military asset, no threat. As far as the MOD is concerned, this is a civilian matter. But the pilot reports Marcus, Eleanor countered, her voice calm and even. 4 of them now. Are we saying they all hallucinated? We're not saying anything, Ashford replied, rubbing his eyes. We are noting their reports and filing them. That's it. There's no budget, no mandate for a formal investigation into something that, according to our primary censors, didn't happen. Eleanor knew he was right. She was asking him to step outside the rigid lines of protocol, to risk his career on a hunch. Look, Eleanor said, changing her approach. I'm not asking for a formal inquiry. I'm asking for data. Raw radar data from Bulmer and Fylingdales for the period in question. Not the filtered, processed summary, but the raw feed. I want to see the noise, the background clutter, everything the system is designed to ignore. Ashford was silent for a long moment. It was a significant request. Raw radar data was highly classified, not because of what it showed, but because of what it revealed about the capabilities of the system itself. I'll see what I can do, he said finally, his voice low, but it will have to be on a need-to-know basis. And right now, officially, you don't need to know. Professor Alistair Brennan had cleared his schedule. He was now completely focused on the data from Malum Tarn. He had contacted Dr. McLeish, and they had spent hours on the phone talking through her findings. He was deeply impressed by her methodology, her caution, her refusal to jump to conclusions. He had also, on a hunch, pulled up some of his old classified research from the S. It was a study of anomalous radar returns over the North Sea, cases that had been dismissed as atmospheric ducting or equipment malfunction. He looked at the old data, the strange, fleeting signals that had been labelled as clutter, and then he looked at the report of the pulsing amber lights over the Pennines. A shiver of recognition ran through him. It was a different phenomenon, a different era, but the signature, the underlying strangeness, felt hauntingly familiar. D.S. Osborne's final primary witness was P.C. Andrew Millward. She met him in a small, sterile interview room at the Skipton police station. Millward was nervous, but his report was a model of professional clarity. He had his logbook open, and he recounted the events of the night with a meticulous attention to detail. He described the pulsing, the silence, the formation. He had, on his own initiative, used a compass app on his phone. There was a deviation, he said, pointing to his notes. About 15 degrees to the east. It only lasted for the duration of the sighting. As soon as the lights were gone, it went back to normal. Claire's pen stopped moving. A compass deviation. That was physical evidence. It was the first piece of hard, measurable data from a ground-level witness. Thomas Greenwood was becoming a local celebrity. A reporter from the Yorkshire Post had found his name in the police log and had driven out to his cottage. The old shepherd, a man who valued his privacy above all else, had been reluctant to speak. But the reporter was persistent, and Thomas felt a sense of duty, a need to have his story told accurately. He gave a brief, factual account, his words chosen with care. The resulting article was respectful, portraying him as a credible, down-to-earth witness. But the headline, "The Shepherd and the Stars," made him cringe. He was not a character in a fairy tale. He was a man who had seen something he could not explain, and he wanted answers, not folklore. James Wickham made a decision. He picked up the phone and called Robert Thorne, the BA pilot, directly. It was a breach of protocol. All such communications were supposed to go through official channels, but he needed to hear it from the source. Thorne was at home, and he sounded relieved to be talking to someone who was taking him seriously. He recounted the sighting with the same calm precision as in his report. "Look," Thorne said, his voice dropping slightly, I've been flying for 30 years. I've seen everything the sky can throw at you. I've seen weather balloons, I've seen military jets, I've seen satellites. This was none of those. This was something under intelligent control, and it was moving in a way that nothing I know of can move. Eleanor Hartley received her first piece of raw data. It was not the RAF radar feed she had hoped for, but the full, unedited logs from the control tower at Leeds Bradford. It was a dense, almost impenetrable stream of numbers and code. She spent hours writing a custom script to filter it and visualize the data, to search for the faintest whisper of an anomaly. Late in the afternoon, she found it. A ghost in the machine. For a period of 12 minutes, coinciding exactly with the main cluster of sightings, there was a subtle, rhythmic pulse in the background radio noise across a specific frequency band. It was too weak to be noticed by the operators, too regular to be random static. It was a signal, and it was pulsing at the exact same rate as the lights the witnesses had described. Claire Osborne presented her preliminary findings to Inspector Davies. She had interviewed the three primary witnesses, the shepherd, the police officer, and the couple with the video. "They're all credible," she said, her tone firm. "There are no inconsistencies in their core accounts. They all describe the same event: silent, amber, pulsing lights in a formation, moving in an unconventional manner." She paused, then added, "And we have a report of a compass deviation from PC Millward." Davies listened, his expression unreadable. He was a man who believed in facts, in evidence. The neat, tidy explanation was beginning to unravel, and he knew it. "All right, Osborne," he said. "Expand the interviews. I want to talk to everyone who filed a report. Let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes." Dr. Fiona McLeish, emboldened by her conversation with Professor Brennan, sent her data to a trusted colleague at the Jodrell Bank Observatory in Cheshire. It was a risk. The scientific community could be brutal in its dismissal of anomalous data. But Jodrell Bank had a long, quiet history of investigating strange signals, a legacy of open-minded curiosity. She sent the email with a mixture of trepidation and hope. She was a scientist on the edge of a great unknown, and she knew she could not explore it alone. She needed more eyes, more minds, more data. In the House of Commons, a backbench MP from a Yorkshire constituency, prompted by the article in the Yorkshire Post, asked a question during a session of the Defence Committee. Can the Minister confirm or deny that the Ministry of Defence is investigating the recent reports of unidentified aerial phenomena over North Yorkshire? The junior minister, Patricia Caldwell, who had signed off on the case just the day before, stood up to answer. She gave the standard pre-prepared reply. "I can confirm that the MOD has reviewed the incident in question and has found no evidence of any unauthorized aircraft or any threat to the United Kingdom. The matter is considered closed." The answer was technically true, but fundamentally misleading, and for those who knew, the word reviewed was doing a great deal of heavy lifting. Eleanor Hartley read the transcript of the minister's statement with a wry, humourless smile. The matter was closed. It was the official institutional response to anything that didn't fit in a neat, predefined box. Deny, dismiss, and file away. But Eleanor knew that the real work often began after the file was officially closed. She looked at the signal she had extracted from the radar logs, the faint, rhythmic pulse that was the first, tentative piece of hard evidence. It was a whisper in a storm of noise, a ghost in the machine, but it was there, and it was a thread, and she was going to pull on it. That evening, David Chen's YouTube video passed 100,000 views. It had been picked up by a national tabloid newspaper, its website now blaring a sensationalist headline, "UFO Invasion of the Dales." The story was illustrated with a crudely photoshopped image of a flying saucer hovering over a field of sheep. Sarah Chen looked at it with a feeling of deep dismay. The profound, unsettling beauty of what she had seen had been twisted into a caricature, a cheap, disposable piece of online clickbait. The gap between her experience and the public narrative had become a chasm. James Wickham sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home. He had the flight paths of the 4 reporting aircraft displayed on his screen, along with the trajectory of the sightings as reported by the police. He was a man caught between 2 irreconcilable truths. The first was the truth of his instruments, his radar, his transponders which showed nothing. The second was the truth of his pilots. 4 experienced professionals who were all telling him the same impossible story. He had always trusted the data, but what if the data was incomplete? What if the instruments were only showing part of the picture? It was a deeply unsettling thought, a crack in the very foundation of his professional world. Claire Osborne, driving home through the dark, winding roads of the Dales, found her own eyes being drawn to the sky. She was a detective, a pragmatist, a woman who dealt in the hard, often brutal, realities of human behavior. But the past 2 days had introduced a new, strange variable into her world. The calm certainty of the shepherd, the nervous conviction of her fellow officer, the awe in Sarah Chen's voice, the report of the compass deviation. These were not the signs of a mass delusion. They were the signs of a genuine shared experience, an experience that as yet had no rational explanation. She looked up at the vast, star-dusted darkness, and for the first time she felt a sense of profound, professional uncertainty. The night of November the 4th was cloudy. A thick blanket of grey obscured the stars, muffling the landscape in a damp, close darkness. There were no new sightings. The skies were empty. But the question remained hanging in the air, in the minds of those who had seen, and in the quiet, secure offices of those who were now, secretly, beginning to investigate. The absence of the lights was now as significant as their presence. It suggested that this was not a random, natural event. It suggested that the phenomenon, whatever it was controlled. It could choose when and where to appear, and it had chosen, for now, to disappear. The silence was a statement. The waiting had begun. By the 3rd day, November the 8th, the story of the Pennine Lights had bifurcated. In the public sphere, it was rapidly descending into a media-driven frenzy, a modern-day myth fueled by grainy videos and speculative headlines. But in the quiet, insulated corridors of power and science, it was evolving into something else entirely, a serious, albeit clandestine, intelligence problem. The official dismissal had created a vacuum, and into that vacuum a small, disconnected group of individuals was being pulled, each holding a single, vital piece of an increasingly complex puzzle. Eleanor Hartley's request for the raw RAF radar data had been met with a wall of bureaucratic silence. Marcus Ashford's initial willingness had cooled, replaced by a formal, cautionary tone. He was a man who understood the institutional immune system. He knew that pushing too hard against the official narrative would trigger a response, and that response would not be pleasant. Eleanor understood. She did not press the issue. Instead, she focused on the data she did have, the faint, rhythmic signal from the Leeds Bradford logs. It was her only solid lead, her only piece of hard, instrumental evidence. She began the painstaking process of trying to triangulate its possible source, a task akin to finding a single needle in a continent-sized haystack. Professor Alistair Brennan, meanwhile, was taking a different approach. He had driven to Jadrell Bank to meet with his colleague in person. The 2 scientists, one a seasoned veteran and the other a rising star, spent the day huddled in a small, cluttered office, the air thick with the scent of old paper and ozone. They reviewed Dr. McLeish's spectroscopic data, comparing it to the observatory's vast library of celestial and man-made signals. They found no match. It was Brennan who suggested the next step. "We need to listen," he said, his eyes gleaming with intellectual fervor. "If this thing is emitting a signal, even a weak one, we need to be listening for it. We should use the big dish, off the record, of course. A calibration exercise." DS Claire Osborne's investigation was expanding. She now had a small team of 3 constables working with her, and they were methodically working their way through the list of over 100 witnesses. The process was slow, repetitive, and largely unproductive. Most of the witnesses had only seen the lights from a distance, their accounts vague and easily dismissible. But a pattern was emerging. The most credible, detailed reports were clustered in specific geographical areas, small pockets of high-quality sightings. And in 2 of these new interviews, another piece of physical evidence was mentioned, a brief, unexplained power cut that occurred at the exact time of the sighting. Another sharp, uncomfortable fact. James Wickham's carefully constructed world was continuing to crumble. He had spent the previous evening at home, poring over historical aviation incident reports looking for precedents. He found none. He had also, in a moment of professional desperation, made a call to a contact at the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration. He had described the Yorkshire incident in hypothetical terms. His American counterpart had listened, then told him a story. A story of a similar incident over Alaska in the 70s involving a Japanese cargo pilot and a series of unidentified radar returns that had been officially dismissed, but which had remained a source of quiet debate within the FAA for years. The conversation left James with a profound sense of unease. This was not a new problem. Thomas Greenwood's quiet life was over. His cottage was now besieged by a small army of journalists, amateur UFO hunters, and curious onlookers. They trampled his garden, spooked his sheep, and offered him money for his story. He had become a prisoner in his own home, the familiar, comforting landscape of his life transformed into a stage. He had retreated into a stoic silence, refusing to speak to anyone. He regretted talking to the first reporter. He had wanted to contribute to a serious inquiry, not to become the star of a rural freak show. He felt a deep, burning anger at the trivialization of what he had seen. Eleanor Hartley's analysis of the faint signal was yielding its first tentative results. The signal was strongest in the logs from the Leeds-Bradford radar, but she had also found faint, almost imperceptible traces of it in the publicly available data from a weather radar station in the Peak District. By comparing the signal strength and timing from the 2 sources, she was able to create a rough triangulation. The result was a large elliptical area of probability, centered squarely over the most remote, inaccessible part of the Yorkshire Dales National Park. It was the same area where the witness sightings had been most concentrated, the same area where the North Craven Fault ran. The pieces were beginning to fit together. At Jodrell Bank, Professor Brennan's calibration exercise was underway. The massive Lovell telescope, one of the most powerful radio telescopes in the world, was slowly, almost imperceptibly scanning the skies over Yorkshire. It was a clandestine operation hidden in plain sight. The official logs would show a routine diagnostic check, but the telescope's sensitive receivers were tuned to the specific frequency band that Eleanor Hartley had identified, listening for a whisper in the background noise of the cosmos. It was a long shot, a speculative gamble based on a chain of unverified reports, but Brennan felt a deep, instinctual conviction that there was something there to be found. Claire Osborne's team found another compass deviation. The witness was a retired army major, a man with decades of experience in navigation and orienteering. He had been walking his dog on the moors and had seen the lights directly overhead. He had checked his compass, a high-quality liquid-filled instrument, and had noted a significant 20-degree swing. He had assumed it was a magnetic anomaly in the local geology, but he had walked the same route for years and had never seen it before. The report, coming from a highly credible, experienced source, added significant weight to P.C. Millward's earlier testimony. Claire now had two independent reports of the same physical effect. Patricia Caldwell, the junior defence minister, received a second briefing on the Yorkshire incident. This one was not a routine summary, but a verbal, face-to-face meeting with a senior civil servant from the MOD's Intelligence Directorate. The tone was different. The civil servant spoke of the pilot reports, the police investigation, and the unusual level of consistency in the witness statements. He did not mention UFOs or aliens. He spoke of unresolved airspace incursions and potential national security implications. He recommended that a low-level internal review be initiated, a quiet gathering of facts to ensure that nothing had been missed. The minister, sensing the subtle shift in the institutional winds, agreed. The case, which had been officially closed, was now unofficially, cautiously, being reopened. James Wickham, armed with the story from his FAA contact, went to his direct superior. He laid out his concerns, the four pilot reports, the historical precedent. He argued that the official explanation was inadequate and that the CAA had a duty to investigate further. His boss, a career bureaucrat with a deep-seated aversion to controversy, was not pleased. He told James in no uncertain terms to drop it. "Our job is to regulate known aircraft, Wickham," he said, his voice cold. "It is not our job to chase ghost stories. The matter is closed. Do you understand?" James understood. He understood that he was at a crossroads. He could follow orders and protect his career, or he could follow the truth and risk everything. Eleanor Hartley received an encrypted email. It was from Marcus Ashford. The email contained no text, only a single, password-protected data file. The password, sent in a separate, innocuous-looking text message, was a line from a Kipling poem they had once joked about. Eleanor's heart beat a little faster. She knew what it was. It was the raw radar data from RAF Fylingdales. Ashford had come through. He had taken a significant personal and professional risk. He had given her the key. Now, she had to find the lock. In the quiet of his study, Thomas Greenwood was writing. He was not writing for the newspapers or the television crews. He was writing for himself. He was documenting everything he had seen, everything he had felt, in a small, leather-bound notebook. He wrote with a slow, deliberate hand, his words simple, direct, and honest. He described the color of the light, the rhythm of the pulsing, the impossible silence. He was creating his own record, a testament against the noise and the nonsense. He was reclaiming his own story. Claire Osborne's team had a breakthrough. By cross-referencing the reports of power cuts with the electricity company's own logs, they found a pattern. At the time of the sightings, a number of small, localized trip-outs had occurred along a specific rural power line. The company had logged them as routine faults, likely caused by high winds or equipment failure. But there had been no high winds that night, and the faults were not random. They occurred in a sequence, a wave of small failures that moved along the power line, a wave that mirrored the reported trajectory of the lights. It was a direct, physical interaction between the phenomenon and the infrastructure on the ground. At Jadrell Bank, they found it. A faint, intermittent signal buried deep in the background noise. It was weak, almost at the threshold of detection, but it was there. It was a series of short, rhythmic pulses on the exact frequency they were looking for. It was not a natural signal. It was not a known satellite. It was artificial. And it was coming from the empty sky directly above the Yorkshire Dales. Professor Brennan and Dr. McLeish looked at the screen, then at each other. They had found the ghost in the machine. and yet it was real. Eleanor Hartley spent the night in her secure office, a lone figure in the silent, empty building. She was immersed in the raw data from Fylingdales, a torrent of information that represented every single object the powerful radar had detected, from birds and insects to high-altitude weather phenomena. She was looking for the impossible, a signal that was there, but not there, a primary radar return that had no corresponding transponder signal, a skin paint on an object that officially did not exist. Her custom-written algorithms churned through the data, searching for the faintest of anomalies. Just before dawn, she found it, a series of 5 fleeting, intermittent returns. They were too small, too brief to trigger an alarm or to be noticed by a human operator. They were ghosts, and their trajectory, their altitude, and their incredible speed matched the witness reports exactly. James Wickham walked into his office, his face set with a new determination. He had made his decision. He sat down at his computer and began to write a formal memorandum to the CAA's Director of Safety and Airspace Regulation. He detailed the 4 pilot reports, the historical precedents, and his own professional concerns. He knew that by sending it he was bypassing his immediate superior and invoking a formal internal review process. He was blowing the whistle. It was the end of his career as a quiet, compliant bureaucrat. It was the beginning of something new, something uncertain, something dangerous. Claire Osborne stood before Inspector Davies' desk, her report in her hand. "Sir," she said, her voice steady, "we have a significant correlation between the sightings and a series of electrical faults. We also have 2 independent reports of magnetic compass deviation. This is no longer just a collection of witness statements. We have evidence of physical effects." Davies looked at her, then at the report. He was a policeman. He followed the evidence. And the evidence was leading him into territory that was far outside the realm of conventional police work. "Right, Osborne," he said, his voice heavy. "Get me a secure line to the Ministry of Defence." In 3 separate, secure locations, the same conclusion was being reached. At DSTL, Eleanor Hartley looked at her radar tracks. At Jadrell Bank, Professor Brennan looked at his radio signal. At the North Yorkshire Police Headquarters, DS Claire Osborne looked at her map of physical evidence. The pieces of the puzzle, held by different people in different organisations, were beginning to snap into place. The picture they were forming was fragmented, incomplete, but undeniable. Something real, something controlled, and something of unknown origin had passed through the skies of North Yorkshire. And the official story, the story of drones and ice crystals, was about to fall apart. The 3rd night was clear and cold. The moon, a thin silver crescent, hung in the western sky. All across the Dales a new kind of observer was watching the skies, not just the curious, but the informed. A detective, a scientist, an analyst, a pilot. They were no longer just looking, they were hunting, they were waiting for the lights to return, armed now with a new and powerful weapon. The knowledge that they were not chasing ghosts, they were chasing something real. November Saint marked a turning point. The disparate threads of evidence previously held in isolation began to converge, forcing a series of quiet, urgent conversations in the background. The public narrative, still fixated on sensationalism, was becoming increasingly irrelevant to the real investigation. The focus was shifting from what people had seen to what the instruments had recorded. The phenomenon was no longer just a story, it was a data set, and the data was painting a picture that was becoming impossible to ignore. Inspector Davies's call to the Ministry of Defence was routed through a series of bureaucratic switchboards before finally landing on the desk of the senior civil servant who had briefed Minister Caldwell. The civil servant, a man named Michael Davenport, listened with a practiced, non-committal patience as Davies laid out the new evidence, the compass deviations, the power line faults. Davenport's response was cool and measured. "Thank you for this information, Inspector. It has been noted. Please forward your full report through the official channels. We will review it in due course." Davies hung up the phone with a sense of profound frustration. He had handed them a live grenade, and they had treated it like a piece of office stationery. Eleanor Hartley, however, had a different reception. She presented her findings. The radar tracks from Fylingdales and the signal analysis from Leeds Bradford. To her own director at DSTL. Her director, a physicist by training and a pragmatist by nature, looked at the data, his expression grim. He recognized the significance and the danger of what Eleanor had found. "This is above my pay grade, Eleanor," he said, his voice low. "And yours. This needs to go upstairs. I'm calling a meeting with the Director of Defense Intelligence." Eleanor felt a surge of adrenaline. The investigation was about to move out of the shadows and into the heart of the UK's intelligence apparatus. James Wickham's memorandum had landed like a bomb on the desk of the CAA's Director of Safety. The director, a former RAF Air Marshal, was a man who did not suffer fools gladly, but he also had a deep-seated respect for the integrity of his pilots. He read James's report, then summoned him to his office. James stood before the imposing desk, expecting a career-ending reprimand. Instead, the director looked at him with a thoughtful, serious expression. "You've taken a significant risk, Mr. Wickham," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But you've also done your duty. I'm grounding the official explanation. As of now, the CAA's position is that this incident is unresolved, and I'm assigning you to a new internal review team. Your job is to find me some answers." Quietly. Professor Brennan and Dr. McLeish published their initial findings. They did not publish them in a peer-reviewed journal, a process that would take months, but on a preprint server, a platform used by scientists to share urgent or time-sensitive research. Their paper was a masterpiece of scientific caution. It was titled "Anomalous Intermittent Radio Signal of Artificial Origin Detected from UK Airspace." It detailed the frequency, the pulse rate, and the triangulation of the signal. It made no mention of lights in the sky or UFOs. It was a dry, technical paper, but for those who knew what to look for, its implications were staggering. The publication of Brennan's paper sent a shockwave through a very specific, very small community. The handful of scientists and analysts around the world who, like Eleanor Hartley, were tasked with monitoring the skies for anomalous events. Within hours, Eleanor's secure terminal was blinking with encrypted messages from counterparts in France, in Germany, and, most notably, from a contact at the US Department of Defense's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO. The messages were all the same. "We're seeing something similar. Let's talk." The Pennine Lights were no longer just a UK problem, they were part of a global phenomenon. Claire Osborne's team continued their work, but the focus had shifted. They were no longer just collecting witness statements, they were gathering data. They were mapping the power faults, charting the compass deviations, and working with the local electricity company to analyze the precise nature of the electrical trip-outs. Claire was transforming a police investigation into a scientific one. She was building a detailed, evidence-based picture of the phenomenon's physical interactions with the environment, a body of work that would prove to be invaluable. In the wake of the tabloid headlines, a new kind of visitor descended on the Dales, the serious, independent UFO researcher. These were not the tin-foil hat brigade, but a network of dedicated, often highly knowledgeable individuals who had been studying the subject for years. They arrived with their own equipment, magnetometers, Geiger counters, high-spectrum cameras. They were respectful, organized, and methodical. They began their own investigation, interviewing witnesses, taking soil samples, and setting up nighttime vigils on the moors. They were a wild card, an unofficial, parallel investigation operating completely outside of government control. Eleanor Hartley's meeting with the Director of Defense Intelligence was a tense, formal affair. It took place in a soundproofed room in the MOD's main building. Eleanor presented her findings with a calm, dispassionate clarity. She showed the radar tracks, the signal analysis, the correlation with the witness reports. The director, a man whose entire life was a secret, listened without interruption. When she was finished, he was silent for a long time. "What is your assessment, Dr. Hartley?" he asked finally. "My assessment," Eleanor replied, choosing her words with care, "is that for a period of approximately 6 hours on the night of November 10th, one or more unidentified craft of unknown origin and capability operated with impunity in UK sovereign airspace." James Wickham's new internal review team consisted of himself, a retired air traffic controller, and a quiet, unassuming engineer who specialized in radar systems. Their official mandate was to review the CAA's response to the incident. Their unofficial mandate, given to James by the Director of Safety, was to find out what the hell was going on. James was now in the strange position of investigating the very mystery he had been ordered to ignore just days before. He had access to the full range of the CAA's data, and he began to use it, searching for other, less obvious anomalies that might have been missed. Michael Davenport, the civil servant who had dismissed Inspector Davies's report, now found himself in a very uncomfortable position. He had the official police report on his desk, detailing the physical evidence. He had the minister's signed-off dismissal of the case, and he had a summons to a meeting with the Director of Defense Intelligence. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that he had made a serious miscalculation. He had followed protocol, but he had failed to recognize the significance of the information he had been given. He had been a bureaucrat when he should have been an intelligence officer. Professor Brennan's paper had an unintended consequence. It provided the independent research community with a vital piece of information, the precise frequency of the anomalous signal. Within a day, a network of amateur radio enthusiasts and UFO researchers had set up their own listening posts, their antennas all pointed at the skies over Yorkshire. The government had lost its monopoly on the data. The hunt was now being crowdsourced. Claire Osborne's investigation took her to the local electricity substation. She met with the chief engineer, a man who was initially skeptical of her inquiry. But when Claire showed him the map of the trip-outs, how they occurred in a sequence that matched the path of the lights, his skepticism turned to professional curiosity. "That's not a normal fault pattern," he said, studying the map. "It looks like a rolling surge, something moving along the line, causing the breakers to trip one after the other. But what could cause that?" He had no answer, but he agreed to give Claire's team access to the substation's detailed diagnostic logs. Eleanor Hartley was formally appointed to lead a new, multi-agency task force. Its official name was the Airspace Anomaly Review Group, a deliberately boring title designed to attract no attention. Its members were drawn from DSTL, the RAF, the CAA, and, crucially, from GCHQ, the UK's Signals Intelligence Agency. Eleanor's small, off-the-books inquiry had just become a major, albeit highly classified, national security investigation. Her first act was to bring James Wickham and DS Claire Osborne into the fold. The analyst, the air traffic controller, and the detective were now on the same team. Thomas Greenwood received a letter. It was from the Ministry of Defence. It was a formal, polite letter, thanking him for his report and informing him that the MOD had concluded its review and had found no evidence of any threat. It was a form letter, a polite dismissal. Thomas read it, then slowly, deliberately tore it into small pieces. He had seen what he had seen. He knew that the official story was a lie, and he knew that the truth was still out there, waiting in the silence of the hills. James Wickham, digging through the CAA's archives, found something. It was a report from a pilot flying a small private aircraft over the same area of the Yorkshire Dales. The pilot had reported a series of dancing amber lights that had paced his aircraft for several minutes before disappearing at high speed. The report had been dismissed as a probable reflection, but the description, the location, and the time of year were all eerily similar to the current incident. The pattern was older, deeper than he had imagined. The first meeting of the Airspace Anomaly Review Group was a clandestine affair, held in a secure, windowless room in London. Eleanor Hartley, James Wickham, and Claire Osborne met for the first time. They were joined by a stern-faced RAF wing commander and a quiet, watchful analyst from GCHQ. They pooled their knowledge, their data, their evidence. Eleanor presented the radar tracks. James presented the pilot reports. Claire presented the physical evidence from the ground. For the first time, all the pieces of the puzzle were on the same table. The picture they formed was coherent, compelling, and deeply disturbing. Professor Brennan received a visitor at his university office. It was a man in a quiet, well-tailored suit who introduced himself as a cultural attaché from the British Embassy in Washington. The man was, in fact, the UK's senior liaison with the US intelligence community. He had come to talk about Brennan's paper. The conversation was polite, academic, but the underlying message was clear. You are treading in sensitive territory. The US government was very, very interested in his findings. The ripples from the Pennine lights were now spreading across the Atlantic. That night, the lights returned. They were not in Yorkshire. They were in the skies over the Brecon Beacons in Wales. A series of amber, pulsing lights, seen by dozens of witnesses performing the same impossible, silent ballet. The amateur radio network lit up with reports of the signal, now coming from a new location. The phenomenon was not static, it was moving, and it was appearing with a new and alarming frequency. In the secure room in London, the news of the Welsh sighting was received with a grim sense of validation. The Airspace Anomaly Review Group was no longer investigating a historical incident. They were tracking a live, ongoing phenomenon. Their mission had changed. They were no longer just gathering evidence. They were in a race against time, a race to understand the nature and the intent of the silent, luminous visitors who had taken up residence in the skies of the United Kingdom. The news of the Brecon Beacons sighting galvanized the Airspace Anomaly Review Group. The event, occurring just 4 days after the initial Yorkshire incident, transformed their investigation from a retrospective analysis into a live, real-time intelligence operation. The phenomenon was not a random one-off event. It was repeatable, it was mobile, and it was demonstrating a clear pattern. The quiet, academic nature of their inquiry was over. It had been replaced by a sense of urgency, a feeling that they were on the cusp of something of profound and perhaps unsettling significance. Eleanor Hartley convened an emergency meeting of the task force at Hours on November and Dowd. The atmosphere in the secure room was electric. The GCHQ analyst, a man known only as Simon, projected a map onto the main screen. It showed the new cluster of sightings in Wales alongside the original cluster in Yorkshire. He then overlaid the signal. Data captured by both Jadrell Bank and the now mobilized network of amateur radio enthusiasts. The signal from Wales was identical to the one from Yorkshire. The same frequency, the same pulse rate, the same artificial signature. It was the calling card of the phenomenon. It's a probe. The words came from the RAF wing commander, a man named Ken Morley. He was a fighter pilot by training, a man used to thinking in terms of threats and capabilities. It's testing our responses. It appeared over a remote area in the north. It waited, and now it's appeared over a remote area in the west. It's mapping our blind spots, our reaction times. Eleanor considered his words. The theory was plausible, even logical, from a military perspective, but it felt premature. We don't have enough data to infer intent, Ken, she said, her voice calm and steady. Let's stick to what we know. We have 2 confirmed appearances, separated by approximately miles an hour. The physical characteristics are identical. That's our baseline. James Wickham's role had shifted. He was no longer just an air traffic analyst. He was a historical detective. He was now leading a small team within the CAA, digging through decades of archives, searching for other ghost stories that might match the pattern. The Yorkshire report had been the first key find. Now armed with the new data from Wales, he expanded his search. He began to cross-reference pilot sightings with reports of unexplained geological or magnetic anomalies, looking for the same combination of factors that had defined the Pennine Lights. DS Claire Osborne was in an awkward position. The Welsh sighting was outside her jurisdiction. The North Yorkshire police investigation was officially focused on the local incident, but she was now a member of Eleanor's task force and the data she was collecting on the ground in Yorkshire. The physical evidence was crucial to the national picture. She began to work a dual track, officially running the local inquiry while secretly feeding her findings into the national one. It was a dangerous game, a bureaucratic tightrope walk that could end her career if she made a misstep. Professor Brennan was ecstatic. The Welsh sighting had confirmed his hypothesis. The signal was not a fluke. It was a repeatable, observable phenomenon. He and Dr. McLeish began to write a second, more detailed paper. They were now working with a consortium of radio astronomers from around the world, all of whom had confirmed the detection of the signal. The scientific community was beginning to mobilize. The story was leaking out, not through the tabloids, but through the quiet, trusted channels of academic discourse. The official narrative of denial was becoming increasingly untenable. In the US, at the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, the news of the second sighting, combined with Brennan's paper, had triggered a high-level alert. They had seen this pattern before, a series of intermittent low observability incursions in sensitive airspace. They had their own data, their own catalogue of similar events. They formally requested a secure liaison-level briefing with their UK counterparts. The problem was now officially international. Eleanor Hartley's first priority was to get ahead of the phenomenon. It's moving, she told the task force, pointing to the map. And it seems to be favouring remote, sparsely populated areas with specific geological characteristics. We need to predict where it might appear next. She tasked the GCHQ analyst and the DSTL geologists with creating a predictive model, a map of potential hotspots across the UK that matched the profile of Yorkshire and the Brecon Beacons. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance of moving from a reactive to a proactive stance. Claire Osborne's team had a major breakthrough. Analysing the diagnostic logs from the Yorkshire electricity substation, they found that the rolling surge that had caused the power cuts had a unique electrical signature. It was not a surge in the conventional sense, but a rapid, localized fluctuation in the alternating current frequency. It was as if the power grid itself had been tuned by an external force. The engineer who found it had never seen anything like it. It was a smoking gun, a direct, measurable fingerprint of the phenomenon's interaction with the environment. James Wickham's archival search yielded another hit. This time, it was from a report from a geological survey helicopter flying over the Peak District. the crew had reported a sudden, catastrophic failure of their navigational instruments, accompanied by a visual sighting of a pulsing amber light that had risen from the ground and paced their aircraft. The incident had been attributed to a combination of instrument malfunction and pilot disorientation, but the location, the description, and the reported physical effects were a perfect match for the emerging pattern. James now had 3 historical cases spanning 3 decades. Eleanor's predictive model was beginning to take shape. The map of the UK was now highlighted with several potential hotspots: the Scottish Highlands, the Lake District, the vast empty spaces of the Salisbury Plain, home to the UK's largest military training area. The model was based on a combination of low population density, specific geological formations, fault lines and high quartz content, and areas of known low radar coverage. It was a map of the UK's blind spots, its quiet forgotten corners. It was a hunting map. Wing Commander Morley, acting on Eleanor's predictive model, began to quietly divert military assets. He couldn't send fighter jets to patrol these areas. That would attract too much attention. But he could retask satellites. He could position mobile radar units for training exercises. He could have RAF patrol aircraft fly unusual routes, their sensor packages reconfigured to look for the specific signatures Eleanor had identified. He was building a net, a quiet, invisible web of sensors, hoping to catch a ghost. In the Brecon beacons, the independent researchers had descended. They were better organized this time, coordinating their efforts through encrypted chat groups. They had the frequency, and they had a location. They set up a perimeter of listening posts around the sighting area, hoping to triangulate the signal with a much higher degree of precision than the national network could manage. They were, in effect, a private, well-equipped and highly motivated intelligence agency. The first secure video conference between the UK's Airspace Anomaly Review Group and the US's AARO was a stilted, formal affair. It was a dance of disclosure, each side hinting at what they knew, but reluctant to share their most sensitive data. Eleanor, representing the UK side, took a calculated risk. She shared the electrical signature data from the Yorkshire power grid, the unique frequency fluctuation that Claire's team had discovered. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then the lead US analyst, a man with a doctorate in physics and the weary eyes of a Cold War spy, spoke. "We've seen that before," he said, his voice heavy with significance. "Off the coast of Virginia." That single admission broke the dam. The US team shared their data on the incident, a series of encounters between US Navy fighter jets and unidentified craft that had demonstrated impossible flight characteristics. The official reports had been leaked to the media, but the deepest, most classified data had not, and that data contained the same electrical signature detected by the advanced electronic warfare pods on the F/A fighters. The phenomenon in the skies over the UK was not just similar to the ones seen by the US Navy, it was the same. It was using the same technology. It was the same entity. James Wickham, now working in parallel with the task force, felt a growing sense of dread. This was no longer a quirky historical mystery. It was a matter of profound global significance. He was an air traffic controller, a man who dealt in the safe, orderly management of aircraft. He was utterly out of his depth. He felt like a man who had been tasked with directing the traffic at a local village fete, only to find himself in the middle of a Formula One race with cars that could fly. Claire Osborne, briefing her team of police constables, had to maintain a difficult balance. She could not share the classified information she was receiving from the task force, but she had to guide her team's investigation based on that information. She told them to focus on historical reports of electrical interference and magnetic anomalies in their local areas, to treat them not as curiosities, but as potential evidence in an ongoing inquiry. Her team, loyal and professional, did as they were asked, unaware that their local police work was now part of a global intelligence operation. Professor Brennan, unaware of the classified developments, was facing his own challenges. His university was becoming nervous about his work. The media attention, the association with the UFO subject, was seen as a threat to the institution's reputation. He was politely but firmly advised to return to his more conventional research. Brennan, a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of knowledge, was being told to stop looking. It was a profound betrayal of the scientific principles he held dear. He refused. On the night of November Ard, the trap was sprung. Acting on Eleanor's predictive model, Wing Commander Morley had positioned a mobile radar unit, disguised as a weather research station, on a high ridge in the Lake District. An RAF Poseidon P Maritime Patrol aircraft, officially on a training flight, was loitering at high altitude, its powerful sensors scanning the ground below. They were watching one of the predicted hotspots. And just after midnight, the phenomenon appeared. A cluster of 5 pulsing amber lights, rising silently from the surface of Wastwater, the deepest lake in England. This time, they were ready. The mobile radar unit got a solid primary return, a skin paint on 5 distinct objects. The Poseidon aircraft, from its vantage point high above, captured the event on high-resolution infrared and optical sensors. The independent researchers, who had also identified the Lake District as a potential hotspot, recorded the signal with a new clarity and strength. For the first time, the phenomenon was being observed simultaneously by a coordinated array of advanced military and civilian sensors. The ghosts were no longer ghosts. They were hard physical targets. The hunt was on. In the secure room in London, the atmosphere was one of stunned, jubilant silence. The successful capture of the Lake District event, witnessed in real time via a secure data link from the Poseidon aircraft, was a monumental breakthrough. They had done it. They had predicted the phenomenon's appearance and had met it with a full suite of advanced sensors. The grainy, ambiguous videos of the past had been superseded by terabytes of clean, high-fidelity data. The ghost had been photographed, measured, and tracked. The hunt had yielded its first and most critical prize. The question of if was gone. Now only the terrifying, exhilarating questions of what and why remained. On board the RAF Poseidon, the crew was a model of professional calm, but the tension on the flight deck was palpable. The 2 sensor operators in the main cabin had been guiding the aircraft's powerful cameras, their voices a steady, focused litany of technical jargon. Confirming 5 distinct thermal signatures spherical in shape, no discernible heat plume, consistent with internal energy source. The pilot, watching the feed on his own display, banked the large aircraft in a wide, graceful orbit, keeping the targets in the center of the sensor's view. They were watching 5 amber orbs rise from a lake, hover in a perfect geometric formation, and then move with a speed and agility that defied the laws of physics. They were professional soldiers, trained for any eventuality. But nothing had prepared them for this. In the disguised weather research station in the Lake District, the 2 RAF technicians stared at their radar screen, their faces illuminated by its green glow. They had a solid, continuous track on 5 targets. The targets were moving at over miles per hour, executing instantaneous degree turns. The system's software, designed to track conventional aircraft and missiles, was struggling to keep up, flagging the targets with a string of error messages. Implausible velocity, non-ballistic trajectory. One of the technicians, a young corporal, looked at his superior. "Sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "what are we looking at?" The older sergeant, a veteran of 2 decades of air defense, didn't take his eyes off the screen. "I have no idea, son," he said, his voice grim, "but we are going to record every single second of it." For the independent researchers, camped out on a cold, windswept hillside overlooking Westwater, it was a moment of pure triumph. Their network of listening posts had captured the signal with unprecedented clarity. Their high-resolution, long-exposure photographs had captured not just the amber lights, but faint structural details within them. They had worked outside the system on a shoestring budget, driven by passion and curiosity. And they had succeeded. They had gathered their own independent, verifiable proof. They knew that the official world would never acknowledge their contribution, but it didn't matter. They had the data. And in the world of science, data was power. Eleanor Hartley was in her element. The initial euphoria of the capture was already fading, replaced by a cold, focused determination. The data was pouring in, a torrent of information that would take weeks, perhaps months, to fully analyze. She began to issue orders, her voice calm and authoritative, delegating tasks to the different members of the task force. "Simon," she said to the GCHQ analyst, "I want a full analysis of the signal structure. Is there any modulation, any sign of complex information?" To Wing Commander Morley, "Ken, I need a full debrief from the Poseidon crew and the radar team, every observation, no matter how small. To the DSTL scientists, I want a full spectrum analysis of the infrared data. Let's find out what kind of energy we're dealing with." The hunt was over. The analysis had begun. James Wickham watched the raw infrared footage from the Poseidon, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The amber orbs were not just lights. They were physical, three-dimensional objects radiating a steady, controlled energy. They moved with a purpose and intelligence that was undeniable. All his life he had worked within a system based on the predictable, mechanical laws of aerodynamics. What he was watching now belonged to a different set of laws, a physics that he did not understand. The dusty, historical reports he had been studying were no longer abstract curiosities. They were the prologue to this moment. The ghosts of the past had just become the solid, terrifying reality of the present. Claire Osborne received a one-line encrypted text message from Eleanor. "We have them." The message was brief, but its meaning was immense. Claire felt a profound sense of relief, of validation. Her own painstaking police work on the ground, the mapping of power faults, the collection of witness statements about compass deviations, was not a sideshow. It was a vital part of the bigger picture. The physical traces she had been documenting were the footprints of the very same objects that the RAF had just tracked on its most advanced sensors. The macro and the micro, the view from a Sir Feet and the view from a Yorkshire lane, were telling the same story. Professor Brennan, through his own back-channel sources in the academic community, heard the rumours. A major multi-sensor event over the Lake District. A confirmation. He felt a surge of professional pride, but also a pang of frustration. He knew that the official investigation would now disappear behind a wall of secrecy. The data, the very thing he craved as a scientist, would be classified, locked away from public scrutiny. He had helped to point the way, to provide the key, but he knew he would not be allowed to see what was behind the door. The preliminary report from the UK task force landed on the desk of the AARO director in Washington. It was concise, factual, and explosive. It contained the initial radar tracks, the thermal imaging, and the signal confirmation. The US director looked at the data, then at his own files from the Virginia incident. The flight characteristics were identical, the thermal signatures were identical, the signal structure was identical. It was definitive proof of a global phenomenon, a single, coherent intelligence operating in the airspace of two of the world's major military powers. He picked up his secure phone and made a call directly to the office of the Director of National Intelligence. Eleanor spent hours studying the initial sensor data, her mind racing. The new information was answering old questions, but it was also raising new, more complex ones. The objects were spherical. They were approximately 3 meters in diameter, and they appeared to be solid. Yet they had no discernible control surfaces, no means of propulsion. They radiated energy, but not in a way that was consistent with any known engine. They moved as if the laws of inertia simply did not apply to them. They were a walking, flying contradiction, a paradox made of metal and light. Wing Commander Morley's debrief of the Poseidon crew was a strange, almost surreal experience. The crew were all highly trained, experienced professionals. They described what they had seen with a clinical, dispassionate precision. But beneath the professional veneer, Morley could sense their profound, unsettling awe. One of the sensor operators, a young woman in her 20s, said something that stuck with him. "They were aware of us, sir," she said. "At one point, one of them broke formation and moved towards us. It just sat there, off our wing, for about 30 seconds. It felt like it was looking at us." This new piece of information, that the object had seemed to react to the Poseidon's presence, added a new layer of complexity. It suggested not just intelligence but curiosity, or, from a more military perspective, it suggested a capability for reconnaissance, a deliberate assessment of the RAF's own sensor platform. Was it a greeting, or was it a warning? Eleanor's team had no way of knowing, but they now had to consider the possibility that they were not just passive observers in this strange, silent dance. They were participants. James Wickham, energized by the new data, redoubled his archival search. He was no longer just looking for lights in the sky. He was looking for a very specific signature: spherical objects 3 meters in diameter, demonstrating trans-medium capability, moving from water to air, and exhibiting an interest in military assets. He began to search through old Royal Navy archives, looking for reports of unidentified submerged objects, or USOs, that had been detected by submarines or sonar buoys. He was expanding the hunt, following the phenomenon into a new domain, the deep, dark waters of the Atlantic. Claire Osborne, acting on a hunch, went back to her maps of the Yorkshire incident. The lights had been seen over the remote, rugged landscape of the Dales, but where had they come from? Where had they gone? She overlaid the trajectory of the sightings with a map of the region's bodies of water. The flight path seemed to originate from the direction of the Gouthwaite Reservoir, a large, deep body of water to the east, and it ended in the direction of the Irish Sea to the west. It was a speculative leap, but the Lake District sighting, where the objects had emerged from the water, provided a new and powerful context. Had the Pennine Lights also been a trans-medium event? Eleanor convened the task force to review the first hours of analysis. The picture was becoming clearer and stranger. The objects were solid, spherical, and intelligently controlled. They could move between water and air with ease. They emitted a complex, artificial radio signal. They radiated a unique thermal and electrical signature, and they were aware of and reactive to their observers. They were, in short, a form of technology so far advanced that they appeared to be magical. "We are dealing," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm, "with a non-human intelligence. There is no other credible explanation." The statement hung in the air of the secure room, a stark, undeniable conclusion. For the first time the word non-human had been spoken. It was a threshold, a point of no return. The investigation was no longer about a technical anomaly or a national security threat. It was about something far more profound, something that would reshape their understanding of the world, of their place in the universe. The weight of that realization settled on each member of the team, a heavy, silent, burden of knowledge. In Washington, the decision was made. The US would offer to share its full data set on the phenomenon with the UK task force. It was an unprecedented level of intelligence cooperation on a subject that was officially a taboo. The offer was a recognition of the gravity of the situation and an admission that no single nation could hope to understand this problem on its own. The alliance that had defined the 20th century was now being quietly, secretly reformed to confront a challenge from the street. Eleanor Hartley stood alone in the secure room long after the other members of the task force had gone. On the main screen was a single, high-resolution image from the Poseidon. It was a thermal image rendered in shades of white, grey, and black. It showed one of the amber spheres hovering silently against the cold black of the night sky. It was a perfect, beautiful, and utterly alien object. It was the face of the mystery. Eleanor looked at it, her mind a whirl of questions, of theories, of fears. She had found her ghost. But now she had to understand it, and she had a growing, chilling suspicion that it was also trying to understand her. The third sighting over the Lake District did not leak to the media. The area was too remote, the military presence too well disguised. The public narrative remained focused on the Yorkshire and Welsh sightings, which were now being dismissed by serious commentators as a form of mass hysteria. The gap between the public's understanding and the secret knowledge of the task force had become a chasm. One world was debating grainy videos and ghost stories, the other was in possession of irrefutable proof of a non-human intelligence, and was facing the terrifying, exhilarating task of what to do next. The hours following the Lake District event were a period of intense, almost feverish, activity within the confines of the Airspace Anomaly Review Group. The successful data capture had been a watershed moment, but it had also opened Pandora's box of profound and unsettling questions. Eleanor's declaration that they were dealing with a non-human intelligence had shifted the ground beneath their feet. The problem was no longer technical or military. It was existential. The team now had to navigate the treacherous waters of their own discovery, while the world outside remained blissfully, dangerously unaware. The first order of business was to analyze the data from the Poseidon and the mobile radar unit. The sheer volume was staggering. Eleanor divided the task force into smaller specialized teams. The GCHQ team, led by Simon, focused on the signal itself. The DSTL scientists took the thermal and optical data. Wing Commander Morley and his RAF analysts took the radar and flight dynamics. They worked in a state of controlled urgency, driven by the knowledge that they were the first humans to ever have access to such a rich, detailed data set on this phenomenon. Simon's team had the first breakthrough. The signal, when analyzed with GCHQ's powerful quantum computers, was not just a simple pulse. It was incredibly complex, containing layers of encrypted information nested within each other like a Russian doll. "It's not a beacon," Simon reported to Eleanor, his voice strained with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "It's a data stream. It's broadcasting information at a density we can't even begin to comprehend. It's like trying to analyze the entire internet compressed into a single 1-second pulse." The phenomenon wasn't just flying through their airspace, it was talking constantly in a language they could not understand. The DSTL team, analyzing the thermal data, made an equally baffling discovery. The amber spheres were not hot. In fact, they were the opposite. The surface of the objects was several degrees colder than the surrounding air. The light they emitted was not a product of heat or combustion. It was a form of luminescence, a cold light, generated by a process that seemed to violate the known laws of thermodynamics. "They're energy sinks," the lead scientist explained to Eleanor. They seem to be drawing energy from the surrounding environment. The light isn't a byproduct, it's a side effect of whatever process they're using for propulsion. Morley's team, analysing the flight dynamics, came to a conclusion that was, if anything, even more disturbing. The objects did not appear to be affected by gravity or inertia in any conventional sense. Their instantaneous acceleration and right-angled turns were not just impressive, they were physically impossible for any object to with mass. The RAF's top physicists brought in to consult on the data were stumped. "They're not flying through the air," one of them said. "They're manipulating space-time around themselves. They're creating a localized warp bubble. It's the only explanation, and it's straight out of science fiction." The formal intelligence sharing with the US began. The first data package from AARO arrived, and it was a treasure trove. It contained not just the Virginia data, but dozens of other similar incidents spanning decades. The US had been tracking this phenomenon in secret for a very long time. As Eleanor's team began to cross-reference the US data with their own, a chilling pattern emerged. The phenomenon appeared in clusters, focusing on specific geographical areas for a period of weeks or months, and then disappearing for years at a time. It seemed to be conducting a systematic, long-term survey of the planet. James Wickham, now with access to the US Naval Archives, found what he was looking for: a series of reports from US nuclear submarines operating in the North Atlantic. The reports detailed the detection of fast-moving, silent submerged objects that had paced the submarines, sometimes for days at a time. The acoustic signatures of these USOs were unlike anything the Navy had ever recorded. And their reported speed and maneuverability underwater were just as impossible as the flight characteristics of the amber spheres in the air. It was the same phenomenon operating in a different domain. Claire Osborne, acting on her hunch about the water connection in Yorkshire, began a new line of inquiry. She started to discreetly investigate the history of the Gawthwaite Reservoir. She found a local legend, a piece of folklore that was usually dismissed as a ghost story. The story told of strange glowing lights that were sometimes seen rising from the surface of the reservoir on cold, moonless nights. The story was centuries old. It was the first indication that the phenomenon's presence in the UK was not a recent development, but something that had been going on for a very, very long time. Eleanor Hartley had to brief the Director of Defence Intelligence on the new findings. The meeting was even more tense than the first. She laid out the evidence, the complex data stream, the cold fusion energy source, the manipulation of space-time, the global and historical nature of the phenomenon. The director, a man not easily shaken, was visibly disturbed. "What is their intent, Dr. Hartley?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "We don't know," Eleanor replied honestly. "They appear to be conducting a long-term systematic reconnaissance of the planet. They are observing us, but for what purpose, we have no idea. They have demonstrated no hostility, but they have also demonstrated a technological capability that is, without exaggeration, thousands of years ahead of our own." The independent researchers analyzing their own data from the Lake District were reaching similar conclusions. They didn't have access to the classified military data, but they had the signal and they had the high-resolution photographs. One of the researchers, an expert in digital image analysis, managed to enhance the photographs of the amber spheres. The enhanced images showed something astonishing. The surface of the spheres was not smooth. It was covered in a complex shifting pattern of geometric shapes, almost like a form of living hieroglyphics. It was the first visual evidence of the complexity that the GCHQ team was seeing in the radio signal. Professor Brennan, now ostracized by his own university, found a new home. He was quietly contacted by the independent research group, who had recognized the significance of his work. They invited him to join their team to bring his expertise to their analysis. Brennan, free from the constraints of institutional bureaucracy, accepted immediately. He was now part of a nimble, agile, and highly motivated team, a scientific guerrilla army operating in the shadows. James Wickham's research was leading him down a rabbit hole of forgotten history. He found that the historical sightings, both in the UK and the US, often correlated with periods of significant human technological or social change. There were clusters of sightings in the late S at the dawn of the nuclear age. There were clusters in the S during the space race. And there were clusters in the late S at the end of the Cold War. It was as if the phenomenon's interest in humanity was piqued by our own developmental leaps. Were they a teacher, a guardian, or just a curious, dispassionate observer? Claire Osborne's investigation into the Gowthwaite Reservoir folklore led her to a local historian. The historian, an elderly woman with a lifetime of accumulated local knowledge, told Claire that the stories of the lights were ancient, predating the construction of the reservoir itself. The lights, she said, were associated with the valley, with the river that had once flowed through it. They were known in the old local dialect as the water sprites. The story was a piece of folklore, but for Claire it was a vital clue. It suggested that the phenomenon's connection was not just to the water, but to the land itself, to the geology of the valley. Eleanor's task force was facing a new and daunting challenge: what to do with the knowledge they had acquired. The evidence was now irrefutable. A non-human intelligence was operating on and around the planet. It was a truth of such monumental significance that it would change everything. The question of disclosure, of whether to tell the public, was now the elephant in the room. The Director of Defense Intelligence was adamant. The information was to be held at the highest level of classification. "The public is not ready, Eleanor," he said. "This would cause panic, social collapse. We need to understand it, to understand the intent before we even consider disclosure." Eleanor understood the logic, but it sat uneasily with her. She was a scientist, a believer in the power of knowledge. To hold such a truth, to keep it from the world, felt like a betrayal. She found herself in an unlikely, unspoken alliance with James Wickham. He too felt the weight of the secret. He had started his journey as a bureaucrat, a man of rules and regulations, but his discovery of the truth had awakened a deeper sense of duty, a duty not just to his organization, but to the public it was supposed to serve. In the days following the Lake District event, the phenomenon went silent again. The skies over the UK were empty, the signal disappeared. It was a pattern the US team had seen before, a period of intense activity followed by a period of quiet. It was as if the phenomenon was giving them time to process, to analyze, to think. The silence itself was a form of communication, a deliberate pause in the conversation. The task force used the time to dig deeper into the data, to build their models, to try and get one step ahead of their silent, enigmatic visitors. Wing Commander Morley was tasked with developing a contingency plan, a plan for what to do if the phenomenon demonstrated hostility. It was a grim, almost impossible task. How do you plan for a conflict with an adversary whose technology is indistinguishable from magic? Every scenario he ran ended in the same stark conclusion. If they wanted to, they could disable the UK's entire military and civilian infrastructure in a matter of seconds without firing a single shot. They were, for all practical purposes, invincible. The UK's only defence was the hope that the phenomenon's intent remained benign. Eleanor Hartley found herself thinking about the Poseidon sensor operator's report, the sphere that had broken formation, that had seemed to look at the aircraft. It was a small detail, an anecdotal observation in a sea of hard data, but it haunted her. The period of silence that followed the Lake District event was a crucial, formative time for the Airspace Anomaly Review Group. The absence of the phenomenon allowed them to shift from a reactive, crisis-driven mode into a more considered, analytical one. It was a time for deep thought, for the consolidation of data, and for the forging of a coherent, unified strategy. The initial shock of their discovery was beginning to wear off, replaced by the grim, professional determination of a team facing a challenge of unprecedented scale and complexity. They were no longer just collecting data, they were building a new understanding of the world. Eleanor Hartley's primary focus was on building a comprehensive picture of the phenomenon's global activity. The data sharing with AARO in the US was proving to be a game changer. Her team began a massive data fusion project, combining the UK and US datasets into a single, unified timeline of events stretching back over 70 years. The patterns that emerged were stunning. The phenomenon's appearances were not random. They correlated not only with human technological advancement, but also with periods of geopolitical instability, with natural disasters, and with rare astronomical events. It was as if they were monitoring the planet's vital signs, both human and geological. James Wickham's historical research had become a key pillar of this effort. He was now working with a team of historians and archivists, both in the UK and the US, digging into military, civilian, and even commercial archives. He found reports from merchant sailors in the SS describing silent, luminous spheres that had risen from the ocean and paced their ships. He found reports from Cold War-era pilots who had been scrambled to intercept unidentified targets over the North Sea, only to find their instruments failing and their targets vanishing. Each report was a single isolated data point, a forgotten piece of the puzzle that, when added to the whole, made the picture clearer and more detailed. Claire Osborne's work on the ground in Yorkshire had also taken on a historical dimension. Her discovery of the water sprite folklore had prompted her to start a new line of inquiry, a systematic review of local historical archives looking for other mentions of strange lights or aerial phenomena. She found dozens of such stories scattered through old parish records, local newspapers, and personal diaries. The stories were often vague, couched in the superstitious language of their time, but the underlying descriptions were hauntingly familiar, silent, glowing orbs, often seen near water, that moved in unnatural ways. The phenomenon, she was beginning to realize, was not just a visitor. It was a resident, a hidden, an ancient part of the British landscape. Wing Commander Morley was focused on the future. He was using the data from the Lake District event to build a new sensor network. He couldn't place advanced military radar all over the country, but he could be smarter. He worked with the DSTL scientists to develop a series of small, discrete sensor pods. These pods were designed to detect the specific thermal and electrical signatures of the phenomenon. They were cheap to produce, and they could be deployed covertly, disguised as weather stations, geological survey markers, or even mobile phone relay towers. He was building a nationwide tripwire, a silent alarm system that would alert the task force the moment the phenomenon returned. Simon, the GCHQ analyst, was engaged in the most challenging task of all, trying to decipher the signal. The complexity was mind-boggling. The data stream was not linear. It was multi-dimensional, holographic. It's like a library, but all the books are open at once, and the pages are written in a language that has no grammar, he explained to Eleanor. He was using GCHQ's most advanced artificial intelligence systems to search for patterns, for repetition, for anything that might be a key. It was a slow, painstaking process, like being an archaeologist trying to translate a completely unknown alien language with only a single fragmented stone tablet. In the independent research community, Professor Brennan was leading a similar, albeit less well-resourced, effort. He and his team were using their network of radio telescopes to build a more detailed map of the signal's characteristics. They made a significant discovery. The signal was not constant. It changed subtly depending on the location of the phenomenon. The flavour of the signal over Yorkshire was slightly different from the one over Wales, which was different again from the one over the Lake District. It was as if the phenomenon was tasting the local environment and broadcasting its findings. The task force was also grappling with the psychological and social implications of their discovery. Eleanor brought in a specialist from DSTL's Human Factors Division, a psychologist who specialized in the effects of extreme stress and secrecy on small, isolated teams. The psychologist conducted a series of confidential interviews with the team members, assessing their mental state, their ability to cope with the burden of the secret. The report was sobering. The team was highly functional, but they were showing signs of stress, of isolation, of the immense cognitive dissonance of living in two worlds, the ordinary, everyday world and the secret world of the phenomenon. James Wickham was a case in point. He was becoming increasingly withdrawn, obsessed with his research. He spent his days in dusty archives and his nights poring over old reports. His marriage was suffering. He couldn't explain to his wife why he was so distant, so preoccupied. The secret was a wall between them, a wall he could not breach. He was living a double life, and the strain was beginning to show. Claire Osborne faced a different kind of pressure. She was a police officer, a public servant. Her instinct was to be open, to be transparent, but she was bound by the Official Secrets Act. She had to lie by omission to her own colleagues, to her own superiors. She had to pretend that her investigation was just a routine inquiry into a local anomaly when she knew it was part of a global intelligence operation. The deception gnawed at her, a constant, low-level hum of professional and ethical conflict. Eleanor Hartley, as the leader of the team, felt the weight of responsibility most acutely. She was responsible not just for the investigation, but for the well-being of her team. She was also the primary interface with the higher echelons of the government, a world of politics and power plays that she despised. She found herself in endless meetings, briefing ministers and intelligence chiefs, fighting for resources, defending her team's work against the ingrained skepticism and bureaucratic inertia of the system. She was a scientist who had become a politician, a spy, and a priest, the keeper of a truth that could change the world, but which she was forbidden to share. The question of disclosure was a constant, simmering debate within the team. Wing Commander Morley was firmly against it. This is a military problem, he argued. The public has no need to know. It would only cause panic and get in the way. James Wickham was increasingly in favour. This is a human story, not a military one, he countered. The public has a right to know. The secrecy is corrosive. Eleanor found herself in the middle, seeing the logic of both arguments. She knew the dangers of premature disclosure, but she also felt the moral weight of the secret. The global picture was becoming clearer. The phenomenon was real, it was ancient, and it was engaged in a long-term, systematic survey of the planet. It was technologically superior to a degree that was almost incomprehensible. Its intent was unknown, but it had so far demonstrated no hostility. It was a dispassionate, silent observer, but for how long? The task force's working hypothesis was that the recent increase in sightings, the new, more overt pattern of behavior, was significant. Something had changed. After centuries of quiet, almost invisible observation, the phenomenon was beginning to make its presence felt. The question was, why? What had changed? Was it something they had done, or was it something they were about to do? Simon's team at GCHQ had a small, tantalizing breakthrough. They couldn't decipher the signal, but the AI had found a pattern. a recurring mathematical constant that was embedded deep within the data stream. It was the value of pi. It was a single, unambiguous sign of intelligence, a universal calling card. But it was more than that, and the value was encoded to an incredible degree of precision, far beyond any practical application. It was a statement, a demonstration of mathematical and computational prowess. It was a quiet, elegant boast. It was the first faint hint of the personality, the culture of the intelligence behind the signal. Eleanor shared this finding with her US counterparts. They were stunned. They had been analyzing the signal for years, but their systems had never found the pi constant. It was a testament to the sophistication of GCHQ's new AI. The discovery spurred a new, more collaborative phase of the analysis. The two teams began to work together as a single, integrated unit, sharing their tools, their data, and their theories in real time. The old cautious dance of disclosure was over. The Allies were now truly united in their search for answers. Claire Osborne's historical research in Yorkshire uncovered another gem. She found a letter written in the S from a local clergyman to a colleague at Cambridge University. The clergyman described his own sighting of the water sprites over the valley. But he was a man of science as well as faith. He had attempted to measure the lights, to triangulate their position. His letter was filled with detailed, careful observations. It was a piece of the century's scientific inquiry into the very same phenomenon that Claire was investigating today. The letter was a bridge across time, a testament to the enduring nature of the mystery. As the winter had deepened, a sense of anticipation was building within the task force. The data suggested that the phenomenon's periods of activity were often linked to the winter solstice. It was a speculative theory, based on a handful of historical data points, but it was the best they had. They began to prepare. Morley's new sensor pods were deployed in secret to the predicted hotspots. The RAF and the Navy were put on a state of quiet, heightened alert. The independent researchers, reaching the same conclusion from their own analysis, prepared their own vigils. All eyes were turning to the longest night of the year. Eleanor Hartley felt a profound sense of destiny, of an impending climax. For 70 years, the world's governments had been grappling with this mystery in secret, collecting fragments of data, wrestling with the implications. Now, for the first time, they were prepared. They were organized. They had a global, coordinated network of sensors and a team of the world's best minds, all focused on a single goal. They had built a trap, a vast, intricate technological and intellectual trap. And now, all they could do was wait and hope that their silent, enigmatic visitors would choose to appear. The secret was taking its toll. James Wickham's wife left him. She couldn't live with the silence, with the man who was there, but not there. Claire Osborne was facing an internal investigation, a routine audit of her investigation that she knew was anything but routine. Professor Brennan was being publicly ridiculed by his former colleagues. The burden of knowledge was heavy, but for the members of the task force, there was no turning back. They were the guardians of the gate, the first line of defense, and the first emissaries in a new and profoundly strange chapter of human history. They were alone together, waiting for the longest night. The first weeks of December were a period of tense, quiet anticipation. The winter solstice, December 8th, was circled on every calendar in the secure room, a date imbued with Ace Day. Significance that was part scientific hypothesis, part gut instinct. The task force worked with a quiet, focused intensity, their every action geared towards preparing for that single, longest night. The silence from the phenomenon was no longer seen as an absence, but as a prelude, the deep, indrawn breath before a momentous statement. The world outside was consumed with the festive season, with Christmas shopping and office parties, its innocence a stark, poignant contrast to the secret world of the task force. Eleanor Hartley was living on a diet of coffee and adrenaline. She divided her time between managing the increasingly complex global data sharing operation and preparing the high-level briefings for the government. The political dimension of the problem was becoming more and more demanding. The Prime Minister had been briefed, as had the leaders of the opposition parties. The secret was now held within the UK's innermost circle of power, a bipartisan burden. The consensus was absolute. The secret must be kept. The potential for social and religious upheaval was deemed too great. The official policy was one of containment and continued covert investigation. Wing Commander Morley's sensor network was now fully operational. Over 100 of the discrete pods had been deployed across the UK, from the Shetland Islands to the coast of Cornwall. They were a silent, invisible web, constantly monitoring the electromagnetic environment, listening for the specific thermal and electrical fingerprint of the phenomenon. Morley had also established a new, secure command and control centre, a dedicated facility from which he could monitor the network and coordinate a rapid response. For the first time, the UK had a purpose-built national system for detecting and tracking the phenomenon. James Wickham's role had evolved again. He was no longer just a historian, he was a profiler. He was using the vast, combined UK/US dataset to build a psychological or behavioural profile of the phenomenon. He was looking for patterns, for habits, for predictable responses. He discovered that the phenomenon rarely appeared over major urban centres. It seemed to actively avoid areas of high population density. It also seemed to be particularly interested in nuclear facilities, both military and civilian. It would often appear near nuclear power stations or naval bases that housed nuclear submarines, observing them for hours or even days at a time, its presence a silent, unnerving statement. Claire Osborne's internal investigation had been concluded. She had been cleared of any wrongdoing, but the process had been a warning, a shot across the bows. Her superiors were suspicious of her secretive, well-resourced investigation. She was forced to become even more careful, to compartmentalize her life even more strictly. Her work for the task force was now conducted entirely outside of official police channels, in her own time, using encrypted devices. She had become, in effect, a spy within her own police force, a role that sat deeply uncomfortably with her sense of identity as a public servant. Simon and his team at GCHQ were making slow, painstaking progress on the signal. They had still not been able to decrypt the main data stream, but they had found other, smaller patterns within it. They had found mathematical constants, not just pi, but the golden ratio and the fine structure constant. They had also found what appeared to be a star map. It was a three-dimensional map of the local galactic neighborhood, but from a perspective that was not Earth's. It was a map that seemed to be centered on a point in the vicinity of the star system, Zeta Reticuli. It was a tantalizing, almost unbelievable clue, but it was also a potential piece of disinformation. The task force treated it with extreme caution. Professor Brennan and the independent research group were preparing their own solstice vigil. They had identified a location in the Scottish Highlands, one of the hotspots on Eleanor's predictive map, as their primary observation point. They had pooled their resources, assembling an impressive array of equipment: radio telescopes, spectroscopic cameras, magnetometers. They were a small, agile, and highly skilled team, and they were determined to capture their own independent data, free from the constraints of government secrecy. The personal toll on the task force members was becoming more apparent. The secrecy was a cancer, eating away at their personal lives, their relationships. Eleanor had not had a proper conversation with her daughter in weeks. Morley's wife accused him of having an affair, unable to understand his long, unexplained absences. The DSTL scientists were becoming paranoid, convinced they were being followed. The psychologist's report made for grim reading. The team was approaching burnout. The solstice was not just a potential date for the phenomenon's return. It was a deadline, a point towards which they were all straining, a finish line they desperately needed to cross. Eleanor, recognizing the danger, implemented a new protocol. She mandated a system of regular confidential debriefings with the psychologist. She also created a buddy system, pairing up team members to provide mutual support. She paired James Wickham, the increasingly isolated historian, with Claire Osborne, the grounded, pragmatic detective. It was an inspired choice. The two of them, from such different worlds, found a common ground in their shared sense of duty and their shared frustration with the secrecy. They began to talk, to share the burden, and in doing so, they forged a strong, supportive friendship. In the run-up to the solstice, the task force ran a series of simulations, wargaming different scenarios for the phenomenon's return. What if it appeared over London? What if it disabled the power grid? What if it attempted to communicate? Morley's scenarios were military, focused on threat and response. Eleanor's were scientific and diplomatic, focused on data collection and potential communication protocols. The GCHQ team even developed a rudimentary first contact package, a simple mathematical language based on prime numbers that could be broadcast if the opportunity rose. The global cooperation was now seamless. The UK task force, the US's AAARO, and smaller, similar groups that had now been identified in France, Germany, and Australia were all connected via a secure, real-time network. They were sharing data, analysis, and theories around the clock. The phenomenon had inadvertently created a new, secret global alliance, a United Nations of the unexplained. The old terrestrial rivalries seemed petty, insignificant, in the face of such a profound and shared mystery. James Wickham's profiling had produced a new and disturbing hypothesis. The phenomenon's increased activity, its new, more overt behavior, seemed to correlate with the rapid recent advances in human artificial intelligence. Was it possible, he theorized, that the phenomenon was not interested in us, in humanity, but in our creation? Was it observing the birth of a new terrestrial intelligence? Was it a rival, a competitor, or just a curious bystander at a momentous evolutionary event? The theory was speculative, but it sent a chill through the task force. Claire Osborne's historical research had also yielded a new pattern. The folklore, the old stories of the water sprites and the dancing lights, often spoke of the phenomenon as a trickster, a capricious, unpredictable entity. It was not seen as a god or a demon, but as something more morally ambiguous, something that operated by its own unknowable rules. This folkloric perspective provided a valuable counterpoint to the task force's more clinical, scientific approach. It was a reminder that they were dealing not just with a technology, but with a personality, a character that had been interacting with humanity for centuries. On December the 2nd, the day before the solstice, Eleanor Hartley gave her final briefing to the Prime Minister. She laid out the preparations, the sensor network, the predictive models, the contingency plans. She also laid out the risks, the uncertainties, the profound and potentially destabilizing nature of what they were facing. The Prime Minister, a man more used to dealing with economic forecasts and political scandals, was quiet for a long time. "Dr. Hartley," he said finally, "what is your personal, professional opinion? What do you think will happen tomorrow night?" Eleanor looked at him. "Prime Minister," she replied, "I have absolutely no idea, but I believe we are as ready as we can possibly be for whatever comes." That evening, a strange sense of calm descended on the task force. The preparations were complete. The trap was set. There was nothing more to do but wait. In the Secure Command Center, Morley and his team monitored the sensor network. In their respective offices, Eleanor, James and Claire watched the data feeds. In the Scottish Highlands, Professor Brennan and his team made their final equipment checks. All across the country, a small, secret community held its collective breath, their eyes turned to the sky, waiting for the longest night and for the return of their silent, enigmatic visitors. The public, meanwhile, was oblivious. The news was filled with stories of travel chaos, of last-minute Christmas shopping, of the rising cost of living. The world was loud, messy, and preoccupied with its own human concerns. The contrast was almost poetic. The biggest story in human history was about to unfold, and nobody was watching. The secret was safe for now. But Eleanor knew that the silence could not last forever. Sooner or later, the world would have to know. The only question was whether the revelation would be a moment of wonder or a moment of terror. As darkness fell on December the 8th, the winter solstice, the sensor network remained quiet. The skies were clear and cold. The moon was a brilliant full disk, flooding the landscape with a pale, ethereal light. In the Secure Command Center, the atmosphere was tense, expectant. Every screen was green. Every system was nominal. The hours ticked by. PM, nothing. A sense of anticlimax of disappointment began to creep into the room. Had their hypothesis been wrong? Had they prepared for a party that nobody was coming to? Then, it happened. A single sensor pod located on the remote uninhabited island of St. Kilda off the west coast of Scotland went red. A thermal and electrical signature, a perfect match. Then another on the Shetland Islands, then another in the Hebrides. A wave of alerts sweeping in from the far north, from the cold, empty waters of the North Atlantic. They were not appearing in one of the predicted hotspots. They were coming from the sea. They were coming in force. And they were heading south. In the command center, the quiet anticipation exploded into a flurry of controlled professional activity. Morley was issuing orders, scrambling assets. The Poseidon aircraft on standby at RAF Lossiemouth was airborne in minutes. The quick reaction alert. Typhoons, the UK's frontline air defence fighters, were brought to a state of immediate readiness. The US and the other allied nations were alerted. This was not a small, localized event. This was a major, coordinated incursion. The longest night had begun, and it was going to be a long and dangerous one. The initial wave of alerts from the St. Kilda and Shetland sensor pods was just the beginning. Within minutes, the entire northern sector of Morley's network was lit up. A vast coordinated wave of objects was moving south from the North Atlantic, a silent luminous armada sweeping across the sky. The scale of the incursion was unprecedented. This was not the small, 5-ship formation of the previous sightings. The command center's screens showed dozens, perhaps hundreds, of individual targets, all moving in a loose but coherent formation. The solstice hypothesis had been correct, but the task force had underestimated the scale and the drama of the event they were about to witness. In the Secure Command Center, Wing Commander Morley was a study in controlled intensity. His initial impulse as a military man was to meet this incursion with force, but he was bound by the task force's primary directive, to observe, to collect data, and not to engage unless there was a clear demonstration of hostile intent. He held the quick reaction alert fighters on the ground, a decision that went against every instinct he had. Instead, he focused on his sensors. "Get me a track on every single one of them," he ordered, his voice cutting through the tense quiet of the room. "I want to know where they're going and what they're doing." Eleanor Hartley, watching the events unfold from her own terminal, felt a profound sense of awe, mingled with a deep, chilling fear. The sheer number of objects was staggering. This was not a reconnaissance mission. This was a statement, a demonstration of presence, of capability, of undeniable and overwhelming superiority. She watched as the wave of light split into smaller groups, each group heading towards a different part of the UK. One group was heading for the Scottish nuclear submarine base at Faslane. Another was heading for the Sellafield nuclear reprocessing plant in Cumbria. Another was heading for the major RAF air base at Coningsby. They were targeting the UK's most sensitive military and energy infrastructure. James Wickham, watching the same feed, saw his profiling work confirmed in the most dramatic way imaginable. The phenomenon's interest in nuclear facilities was no longer a theory, it was a demonstrated fact. He felt a sense of intellectual validation, but it was a hollow, terrifying victory. He was watching a silent, ghostly fleet of unknown objects systematically surround his country's most powerful and dangerous sites. The historian in him was screaming a warning. This is how invasions begin. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, inexorable, and terrifying demonstration of control. Claire Osborne was at home, off duty, when she received the alert on her encrypted phone. It was a single, pre-arranged code word from Eleanor, Cascade. It meant a major, nationwide event was in progress. Claire's role was to monitor the civilian emergency services network, to listen for the first signs of public reaction, of panic. She logged into the police network from her secure laptop, her heart pounding. For now, the network was quiet. The objects were flying at high altitude and over remote areas. The public was still unaware. But she knew that could change in an instant. Professor Brennan and his team, camped out in the cold of the Scottish Highlands, had a front row seat. Their instruments went wild. The radio signal was no longer a faint whisper. It was a roar, a deafening chorus of complex, overlapping data streams. Through their telescopes, they could see the sky filled with the silent, pulsing amber spheres. They were witnessing the event of a lifetime, a moment that would redefine the science of astronomy. Brennan, tears streaming down his face in the cold night air, could only stare, his mind struggling to comprehend the sheer, majestic, and terrifying beauty of what he was seeing. The RAF Poseidon, now airborne, was vectored north to intercept the main group of objects. The crew, who had been so awed by the sight of 5 objects over the Lake District, were now faced with the prospect of flying into a fleet of hundreds. The pilot, a flight lieutenant with a reputation for ice-cold nerves, kept his voice steady as he communicated with Morley's command center, confirming visual on multiple targets extending from horizon to horizon. The sensor operator added, his voice strained, "They're not just spheres, sir. We're seeing different morphologies. Some are cylindrical, some are triangular. It's a mixed fleet." This new information, that the fleet was not uniform, was a major revelation. It suggested a level of complexity, of organization, that the task force had not anticipated. Were the different shapes different types of craft, with different functions? Were they the equivalent of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers? The military analogy was unavoidable and deeply unsettling. The GCHQ team, analyzing the now overwhelming radio signals, confirmed that they were detecting multiple, distinct data streams, each with its own unique characteristics. It was not a monologue, it was a conversation, a symphony of different voices, all talking at once. As the objects reached their designated targets, the nuclear facilities, the air bases, they did not attack. They simply stopped. They took up stationary positions in the sky, forming a perfect, silent perimeter around each site. They hung there, their amber lights pulsing in the cold winter sky, a ring of silent, luminous sentinels. At the Faslane Naval Base, the home of the UK's nuclear deterrent, the duty officers stared at their radar screens in stunned disbelief. The sky above them was filled with dozens of unidentified targets, and their own powerful military radar had been completely blind to their approach. Now, the public began to see. The objects were no longer at high altitude. They were low, visible, and undeniably real. The emergency lines lit up from the north of Scotland to the south of England. The system was overwhelmed. The first shaky videos began to appear on social media, not of faint, distant lights, but of large structured craft hanging silently over some of the UK's most sensitive locations. The secret was out. The containment had failed. The world was about to change live on television. In the Prime Minister's emergency briefing room in Whitehall, the atmosphere was one of controlled panic. The nation's entire defence and intelligence leadership was assembled, watching the events unfold on a bank of giant screens. The Prime Minister had to make a decision how to respond, how to address the nation. The military chiefs were urging a show of force, a scrambling of the Typhoon fighters. Eleanor Hartley, patched in via secure video link, argued passionately against it. "This is not an attack," she insisted. "It is a demonstration. They are showing us that they can hold our most valuable assets at risk, at will. If we respond with aggression, we will be playing into their hands. We must not be the first to blink." James Wickham, listening to the debate, was reminded of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Two superpowers locked in a tense, silent standoff. But this time, the other superpower was not from Moscow. He watched the live feed from a police helicopter that was hovering near the Sellafield nuclear plant. The screen showed a vast, triangular craft, hundreds of meters long, hanging in complete silence over the facility, its amber lights illuminating the surrounding countryside. It was a sight of such profound, terrifying power that it made the UK's own nuclear deterrent seem like a child's toy. Claire Osborne's world had become a nightmare. The police network was in chaos. The emergency services were completely overwhelmed. She was listening to the raw, unfiltered panic of a nation waking up to an impossible new reality. She heard reports of traffic jams, of people abandoning their cars on the motorways to stare at the sky. She heard reports of power outages not caused by the phenomenon directly, but by the sheer, unprecedented surge in demand as millions of people turned on their televisions and their computers. The infrastructure of the country was beginning to buckle under the weight of the revelation. Then the phenomenon made its next move. At precisely Greenwich Mean Time, all the objects, all across the country, began to emit a new signal. It was not the complex encrypted data stream they had been broadcasting before. It was a simple, clear, and universally understandable signal. It was the GCHQ First Contact package, the sequence of prime numbers, the mathematical language that the task force had developed as a potential greeting. They were talking back, and they were using the language that had been offered to them. In the GCHQ Analysis Center, Simon and his team could only stare at their screens in stunned silence. The phenomenon had not only detected their feeble attempt at communication, it had understood it, and it was now replying, broadcasting that same simple, mathematical hello from hundreds of different points in the sky. It was a moment of breathtaking intellectual beauty, a successful communication between two different species, two different intelligences. It was the moment that humanity had been dreaming of and dreading for centuries. Eleanor Hartley knew what she had to do. She had to respond. The GCHQ team had a second stage package ready, a more complex sequence that encoded basic scientific and astronomical data, the periodic table, the structure of DNA, the position of the Earth in the solar system. It was a risky move. It was giving away information, but it was the only way to continue the conversation, to show that they were an intelligent species, capable of a dialogue. With the Prime Minister's hesitant approval, she gave the order. "Broadcast the package," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Let's see if they're really listening." As the GCHQ broadcast went out, a new and even more extraordinary thing happened. The objects in the sky began to change. The silent, amber lights began to shift, to reconfigure themselves. Over each of the sensitive sites, the dozens of smaller lights began to coalesce, to merge, forming vast, intricate patterns in the sky. They were displaying in light the very same information that GCHQ was broadcasting. They were showing the double helix of DNA over the Faslane submarine base. They were showing the periodic table over the Sellafield nuclear plant. They were creating a live visual representation of the data they were receiving. It was a display of such breathtaking artistic and technological brilliance that it defied description. In the streets below, the panic began to subside, replaced by a sense of profound collective awe. People were standing in the roads, on their rooftops, looking up at the silent, luminous classrooms in the sky. The fear was being replaced by wonder. This was not an invasion. This was not a threat. This was a lesson, a greeting, a first contact of unimaginable beauty and grace. Eleanor Hartley watched the live news feeds, tears streaming down her face. She had been so focused on the threat, on the danger, that she had failed to consider this possibility. The possibility of beauty, of communication, of a benign and even artistic intelligence. She had been a soldier when she should have been a diplomat. The Prime Minister, watching the same scenes, made his decision. He would address the nation. He would not lie. He would not dissemble. He would tell the truth. He would tell the world that they were not alone and that the visitors, whoever they were, had come in peace. Not in war, but in peace. The Prime Minister's address to the nation and to the world was a moment that would be etched into human history. Speaking from a lectern in Downing Street, his face pale but his voice steady, he confirmed the presence of the objects acknowledged there, technological superiority, and described the peaceful, communicative nature of the encounter. He did not use the words aliens or extraterrestrials. He referred to them simply as the visitors. He announced the formation of a new international body under the auspices of the United Nations to coordinate a global response and to continue the dialogue that had begun in the skies over the UK. It was a speech that marked the end of one era of human history and the beginning of another. For the members of the Airspace Anomaly Review Group, the Prime Minister's speech was a moment of profound and deeply strange vindication. The secret they had carried for so long was now public knowledge. The burden had been lifted, but it had been replaced by a new and in some ways more daunting responsibility. They were no longer a secret clandestine group. They were the core of the new official UK delegation to the International Contact Initiative. Their work was just beginning. Eleanor Hartley watched the speech from the Secure Command Centre, surrounded by her team. When it was over, a strange, quiet sense of anticlimax filled the room. The biggest secret in human history was out, and the world had not ended. The panic had subsided, replaced by a global wave of curiosity, of wonder, of a million different questions. Eleanor felt a sense of immense relief, but also a sense of profound trepidation. The easy part, the secrecy, was over. The hard part, the diplomacy, the science, the sheer mind-boggling complexity of what came next, was just beginning. As the dawn broke on December end, the visitors departed. The vast, luminous patterns in the sky dissolved. The hundreds of craft all across the country ascended vertically, silently, and vanished from sight. The signals ceased. The silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of absence, but the silence of a conversation paused. They had made their statement. They had opened a dialogue, and now they had retreated, leaving humanity to process, to debate, and to decide what to do next. In the days and weeks that followed, the world was a different place. The event, which became known as the Solstice Manifestation, was the only topic of conversation, of news, of debate. Science, religion, politics, art. Every aspect of human culture was re-examined in the light of the new reality. There were scenes of celebration, of unity, of people from different nations and cultures coming together in a shared sense of wonder. There were also scenes of fear, of conflict, of old anxieties and prejudices being projected onto the silent, unknown visitors. Professor Brennan became an overnight global celebrity. He was the scientist who had first detected the signal, the man who had been vindicated in the most spectacular way imaginable. He was besieged by media requests, by offers of funding, by invitations to speak at conferences around the world. He had gone from being an academic outcast to being one of the most famous and respected scientists on the planet. But Brennan had little interest in the fame. He was focused on the data, on continuing the work, on trying to understand the nature of the intelligence that had so gracefully and so terrifyingly announced its presence. James Wickham's life was also transformed. His work in the CAA archives, his profiling of the phenomenon, was now seen as a vital, pioneering piece of research. He was no longer a dusty, forgotten historian, but a key expert in the new field of exoarchaeology. He was tasked with leading a global effort to search through the world's archives to build a complete history of the visitors' interactions with humanity. The work was his passion, but it was also a painful reminder of his own personal loss. He was helping to unite the world, but he had lost his own small world in the process. Claire Osborne was promoted. Her meticulous police work, her discovery of the physical traces in Yorkshire, was held up as a model of modern, evidence-based investigation. She was asked to lead a new national unit tasked with investigating any future ground-level events associated with the visitors. She had gone from being a small-town detective to being one of the country's leading experts on the physical effects of the phenomenon. But she still felt a sense of unease. She was a police officer. Her job was to protect the public, and she knew with a deep, instinctual certainty that they still had no idea what they were dealing with, or whether it was truly and permanently benign. Wing Commander Morley was now one of the UK's top military advisors to the new UN Contact Initiative. His role was to assess the visitors' capabilities, to understand their technology from a defense perspective. The data from the Solstice Manifestation was a goldmine. He and his teams were beginning to understand the principles of the visitors' propulsion systems, their energy sources, their ability to manipulate space-time. It was a technological leap of thousands of years, and it had been delivered free of charge in a single 6-hour lesson. The military implications were staggering. The nation that could first replicate that technology would become the new, undisputed superpower on Earth. A new and deeply dangerous arms race had begun, not against the visitors, but among humanity itself. Simon and the GCHQ team were at the heart of the global effort to decipher the signal. The main data stream was still a mystery, but the visitors' use of the First Contact package had provided a vital clue. It showed that they were capable of understanding human language and mathematics. It suggested that the main signal was not an undecipherable alien language, but something more complex, a vast, multi-layered database, a library of information, perhaps the sum total of their species' knowledge. The key was not to translate it, but to find the index, the table of contents. The hunt for the Rosetta Stone had begun. Eleanor Hartley was appointed as the UK's lead scientific delegate to the new UN body, which was named the Committee on Extraterrestrial Communication, CEXC. etc. Her life was now a blur of international travel, of high-level meetings in Geneva, New York, and Beijing. She was working with the world's top scientists, its most powerful politicians, its most brilliant minds, all focused on a single goal: to understand the visitors and to continue the conversation they had started. It was the most important job in the world, and it was a lonely, exhausting, and often frustrating one. The world was struggling to adapt to the new reality. Religions were in turmoil, trying to reconcile their ancient faiths with the undeniable proof of non-human intelligence. Economies were in flux, as the prospect of a new, visitor-derived technologies created both opportunity and instability. Societies were divided between those who welcomed the visitors with open arms and those who feared them as a potential threat, a silent, existential competitor. Humanity had been given the greatest gift in its history, the knowledge that it was not alone, and that gift was threatening to tear it apart. In the midst of this global upheaval, the visitors remained silent. The skies were empty. The signal was gone. Their dramatic, planet-wide demonstration had been followed by a profound and deeply unsettling silence. It was as if they had knocked on the door, introduced themselves, and then stepped back to watch, to see how the inhabitants of the house would react. The ball was in humanity.